They told us civilization began in Mesopotamia, in the fertile valleys where writing first appeared and cities first rose. The textbooks draw a clear line. Before 3500 BCE, scattered hunter-gatherers. After, the sudden flowering of urban life, agriculture, and written records. The story is neat, linear, and according to mounting evidence, incomplete. What if the cities we call first were not beginnings at all, but the latest chapter in a story we have forgotten? Beneath the oceans, under deserts, and buried in jungles lie the shadows of cities so ancient they predate our oldest records. Cities that flourished, thrived, and then vanished so completely that only geology and myth remember them. These are not the ruins of fallen empires documented and mapped, their kings listed and their wars recorded. These are ghost civilizations, places that disappeared without leaving their names behind, erased so thoroughly that mainstream archaeology struggles to accept they existed at all. The evidence, however, whispers otherwise. Since the peak of the last ice age 20,000 years ago, global sea levels have risen more than 120 meters. That rise submerged millions of square kilometers of coastal plains, the very places where early human settlements would have clustered near rivers and harbors. The continental shelves that now rest beneath hundreds of feet of water were once dry land, habitable, fertile, and if humans were already anatomically modern for 200,000 years, almost certainly occupied. Every year, new technologies reveal what previous generations could not see. LiDAR penetrates jungle canopy to expose forgotten cities. Satellite imaging detects buried structures beneath desert sands. Underwater surveys map geometric anomalies on the seafloor. And with each discovery, the same question resurfaces. If this much was hidden in plain sight, what else lies waiting in the depths we have not yet explored? The ghost civilizations are ghosts not because they were imaginary, but because time erased them with ruthless efficiency. Rising seas swallowed coastal cities, catastrophic floods buried river valleys, advancing deserts consumed oases, and when the survivors scattered, carrying only what they could remember, the names of their lost homes faded into myth. Tonight we search for those ghosts beneath the waves and sand, following the traces they left in stone, in story, and in the mysteries that refuse to fit the timeline we have been taught. The lost cities that time erased, the civilizations that vanished without a trace. Imagine standing on a beach today, waves lapping at your feet. The tide is out, sand stretches toward the horizon, where ocean meets sky in a hazy line. Now walk backward through time. Not metaphorically, but geologically, reversing the planetary changes that shape the modern world. The ocean retreats. Step by step, meter by meter, the seabed emerges from beneath the waves. 20 meters down, and you're standing where Bronze Age ships once sailed. 50 meters, and the coastline of early agricultural societies appears. 70 meters deeper, and you reach the shores where Neolithic peoples fished and gathered. 100 meters below current sea level, you are walking on land that has not seen sunlight in more than 10,000 years. At 120 meters below the modern waterline, you reach the coastline of 12,000 years ago, the boundary between the Ice Age world and our own. The land that stretches before you, now buried under crushing depth and darkness, once held forests, rivers, wildlife, and according to mounting evidence, cities. This is the drowned world. Not the mythical Atlantis sinking in a single, catastrophic day, but the geological reality of an entire planet's coastlines swallowed by the returning ocean. And it happened not in legend, but in recent prehistory, within the memory span of human civilization itself. The numbers are staggering. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than today. Some estimates push the figure higher to 130 or even 140 meters in certain regions. The difference was not subtle or localized, it was planetary, transforming the shape of every continent. Geologists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have reconstructed the timeline with remarkable precision. The ice sheets that covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia during the glacial period locked away so much water that the oceans shrank, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. These submerged extensions of the continents, invisible to us now, were once dry land, plains and valleys, as real as any on Earth today. Where the water went is no mystery. It was frozen, stacked in kilometre-thick glaciers, covering Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. The ice sheets were so massive they depressed the bedrock beneath them, deformations that persist in geological records today. When the planet warmed and the ice began to melt, all that frozen water had one place to go, back into the oceans. But the return was not gradual. It came in pulses, surges of catastrophic flooding that reshaped coastlines within human lifetimes. Marine geologists call them meltwater pulses, episodes when enormous volumes of glacial meltwater poured into the oceans over periods measured in decades or centuries, rather than millennia. Meltwater Pulse 1A, dated to approximately 14,600 years ago, raised global sea levels by an estimated 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. Some studies suggest the rise happened even faster, concentrated into a single century of relentless inundation. For coastal populations, the change would have been visible within a generation. Shorelines that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly advanced inland, meter by meter, year by year, drowning river deltas and coastal plains. Meltwater Pulse 1b, occurring around 11,500 years ago near the end of the Younger Dryas period, added another 7.5 meters of sea level. Wallahi's rise. Smaller pulses continued for millennia afterward, each one redrawing the map of the habitable world. The mechanism behind these pulses remains debated. Some geologists propose the collapse of ice dams, holding back massive glacial lakes. Lake Agassiz in North America, for instance, contained more water than all modern Great Lakes combined. When its ice barriers failed, the lake emptied catastrophically into the ocean, raising global sea levels within weeks. Other researchers point to ice sheet instability, where warming temperatures undermined the structural integrity of glaciers, causing sections the size of countries to slide into the sea. Either way, the result was the same: rapid, devastating flooding that gave coastal inhabitants little time to adapt. To understand the scale of what was lost, consider the geography. The continental shelves, the relatively shallow underwater extensions of continents, were almost entirely exposed during the Ice Age. These are not deep ocean trenches or abyssal plains. They are gently sloping seabeds that drop gradually from the coastline before plunging into deeper water. At 120 meters lower sea level, all of this was land. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf connected modern Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Borneo into a single continuous landmass, twice the size of India. Rivers drained across this vast plain, creating fertile valleys and coastal zones. When the seas returned, they swallowed 1.85 million square kilometers, an area larger than Alaska. In northern Europe, Doggerland stretched between Britain and continental Europe, a low-lying region of wetlands, forests, and rivers now entirely submerged beneath the North Sea. Fishing trawlers occasionally dredge up evidence of this lost world: mammoth bones, stone tools, and remnants of ancient forests preserved in the cold seabed mud. The Persian Gulf was not a gulf at all, but a river valley draining the highlands of Iran and Arabia. Bathymetric surveys reveal paleo river channels still visible on the seafloor, ancient waterways that once sustained ecosystems now buried beneath 50 meters of salt water. Off the coast of India, the continental shelf extended hundreds of kilometers beyond the current shoreline. The same is true for the eastern coast of North America, where the edge of the shelf lies 100 kilometers offshore. Australia was connected to New Guinea and Tasmania, forming a megacontinent called Sahul. The Mediterranean coast was farther out. The Caribbean islands were larger. Every coastline, without exception, was different. And humans were there. They had to have been. Archaeological consensus holds that anatomically modern humans evolved roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. By 100,000 years ago, human populations had spread across Africa and into Eurasia. By 50,000 years ago, they had reached Australia, a migration that required watercraft and navigation. These were not primitive nomads stumbling blindly across continents. They were sophisticated peoples capable of planning, tool-making, symbolic thought, and complex social organization. Where did these populations live? Overwhelmingly, near water. Rivers provided fish, transport, and irrigation. Coasts offered shellfish, predictable food sources, and access to trade networks. Even today, despite thousands of years of inland settlement, the majority of human population clusters within 100 kilometers of coastlines. During the Ice Age, the most productive coastlines were the ones now underwater. The exposed continental shelves were not barren tundra. They were temperate plains with reliable water sources, game animals, and marine resources. These would have been prime real estate for any human population, the most desirable land available. If settlements existed there, and logic suggests they must have, then those settlements are now 50 to 120 meters beneath the ocean surface, buried under marine sediments, scattered by currents, invisible to conventional archaeology. This is not speculation, it is statistical inevitability. If humans lived near coasts and coasts were in different places, then evidence of human occupation is submerged. The only question is scale. Were these settlements temporary camps, seasonal fishing stations occupied for a few weeks each year? Possibly. That is the conservative interpretation, the one that fits comfortably within existing frameworks. Or were they permanent villages, towns, perhaps even cities, places where populations gathered year-round, developed agriculture, constructed monuments, and created the social complexity we associate with civilization? The second possibility is harder to accept because it challenges the narrative of civilization's origins. If sophisticated settlements existed before the flooding, then the sudden appearance of agriculture and urbanism around 10,000 years ago might not represent an invention, but a recovery. Survivors from drowned coasts would have carried their knowledge inland, teaching upland populations techniques developed over millennia in the lost lowlands. The evidence for this interpretation is circumstantial but growing. Agriculture appears independently in multiple regions around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Valley, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The coincidence of timing suggests a shared catalyst, possibly the same environmental pressures and population movements caused by rising seas and climate change. Similarly, monumental architecture appears seemingly out of nowhere at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9500 BCE. There is no local precedent for the sophisticated stoneworking techniques displayed there, no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. It is as if the knowledge arrived fully formed, imported rather than invented. If coastal populations were displaced by flooding, they would have migrated inland, encountering hunter-gatherer groups in the highlands. The refugees would have brought knowledge of seafood harvesting, boat building, and coastal resource management. Knowledge useless in their new inland environments, but adaptable to rivers and lakes. They might also have brought cosmological beliefs, myths, and memories of the homes they had lost, stories that would later crystallize into flood legends. The ocean remembers what we have forgotten. Beneath the waves lies an archive of human experience, entire landscapes sealed away by rising water, waiting for the tools and determination to retrieve them. But the drowned world is not easily excavated. Underwater archaeology is expensive, technically demanding, and limited by depth. Most surveys focus on shallow waters where diving is possible, depths of 20 to 40 meters where wrecks and submerged structures can be investigated by teams of divers. Beyond that, costs multiply. Remotely operated vehicles, submersibles, and deep water sonar require resources that few projects can afford. Even when surveys occur, interpretation is difficult. Natural geological features can resemble artificial construction. Rectangular blocks of stone might be quarried by humans or fractured by tectonic activity. Linear formations might be walls or erosion patterns. Without clear context, artifacts or inscriptions, ambiguity remains. Yet ambiguity is not absence. The fact that evidence is hard to find does not mean it does not exist. It means we are looking in the hardest place possible, beneath water, beneath sediment, in a medium that corrodes metal, dissolves bone, and scatters organic material across kilometers of seafloor. The question then becomes, if millions of square kilometers of habitable land vanished beneath the waves, and if humans had already been anatomically modern for 200,000 years, what were they doing on those coasts? Were they merely surviving, hunting, and gathering as conventional models suggest, leaving behind only scattered stone tools and campsites? Or were they building, organizing, creating the foundations of what we call civilization, only to have their work erased when the ocean returned? And when the waters rose, did they simply abandon their settlements, walking away from fishing villages and seasonal camps without looking back? Or did they lose something more profound, something that would take millennia to rebuild? To answer that, we begin where the evidence is strongest, where underwater ruins have already been found and documented, preserved in the cold darkness that swallowed them. We begin in the shallow waters of the Mediterranean, where a village frozen in time reveals what the drowned world might have looked like before the flood. Off the coast of Israel, beneath 9 meters of water, lies a village frozen in time. Stone wells, paved floors, a semicircle of standing stones surrounding a freshwater spring, skeletons still in their graves, positioned as they were laid to rest 9,000 years ago. This is Atlit Yam, and it should not exist. According to conventional timelines for the Levantine coast, permanent settlements with stone architecture, communal monuments, and evidence of agricultural surplus did not appear in this region until the Bronze Age, thousands of years after Atlit Yam was already thriving. Yet here the village rests, preserved in seabed sediment 200 meters offshore from the modern town of Atlit, its structures intact, its layout readable, its story waiting in the cold Mediterranean silence. The village did not decay, it drowned. Atlit Yam was discovered in 1984 by marine archaeologist Ehud Galili during a survey of Israel's coastal waters. What sonar initially detected as geometric anomalies on the seafloor became, upon closer investigation, one of the most significant underwater archaeological sites ever found. The preservation was extraordinary. Organic materials that would have rotted within decades on dry land, wood, plant fibers, seeds, and bone remained intact beneath the sediment and seawater, creating a snapshot of Neolithic life unmatched by terrestrial sites. Radiocarbon dating of multiple samples, including wood from structural posts, charcoal from hearths, and organic material from burials, consistently places the settlement's occupation between 7050 and 6900 BCE. 9,000 years ago, give or take a century. The site covers approximately 40,000 square meters, roughly the size of 6 football fields, though portions remain buried under sand and silt. What has been excavated reveals a level of social organization and technological sophistication that challenges assumptions about pre-Bronze Age coastal communities. At the center of the settlement stands its most enigmatic feature, 7 megalithic stones arranged in a semicircle around a freshwater spring. The stones are roughly oval, each standing between 1.0 and 2.1 meters tall, positioned with deliberate spacing to form an arc. The largest stones weigh an estimated 600 kilograms. Moving them required coordination, planning, and labor organization beyond what small family groups typically muster. The spring they encircle was clearly central to the community's life and ritual practice. Freshwater springs in coastal regions are precious resources, providing potable water without the salt contamination that plagues wells near the sea. That the residents chose to monumentalize this spring with standing stones suggests it held significance beyond mere utility. Water sources in many ancient cultures were considered sacred, dwelling places of spirits or gods, and the effort invested in this monument indicates similar beliefs may have been present at Atlit Yam. Surrounding the megalithic circle, archaeologists have identified stone-built houses with rectangular floor plans, plastered floors, and stone-lined hearths. The floors show clear demarcation of living spaces, storage areas, and food preparation zones. This is not the temporary shelter of nomadic hunters, but the permanent architecture of settled agriculturalists. The evidence for agriculture is unambiguous. Excavations recovered carbonized seeds of emmer wheat, barley, lentils, and flax. Stone grinding tools, mortars, and pestles used for processing grain were found throughout the site. The presence of domesticated crops this early in a coastal setting complicates the traditional narrative that agriculture spread from inland river valleys to coastal regions. Perhaps the spread was more complex, with coastal populations developing their own agricultural traditions in parallel to inland centres. Or perhaps knowledge moved in multiple directions, carried by traders and migrants along sea routes. Animal bones recovered from the site include cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, all in proportion suggesting domestication rather than hunting. Wild species are present too, deer, gazelle, and aurochs, indicating a mixed subsistence strategy, combining husbandry with opportunistic hunting. The diversity suggests a stable, adaptable economy capable of weathering seasonal variations in resource availability. But the most revealing finds come from the water itself. Atlit Yam was fundamentally a maritime community. The residents were not merely living near the sea, they were living from it. Hundreds of fishing weights, small stones with holes drilled through them for attachment to nets, have been recovered. Fish hooks carved from bone show wear patterns consistent with regular use. The skeletal remains of Mediterranean fish species, including grouper, sea bream, and parrotfish, dominate the faunal assemblage. One burial contained a fishing net draped over the deceased, a funerary practice suggesting the individual's identity was bound to the sea and its harvest. Perhaps most extraordinarily, the site contains a stone-built well lined with wooden planks, the oldest known example of such construction in the archaeological record. The well was positioned to tap freshwater aquifers beneath the seafloor, demonstrating hydraulic engineering knowledge typically associated with much later periods. The wooden lining, preserved by anaerobic conditions in the waterlogged sediment, has been dendrochronologically dated and provides precise calibration for the site's occupation timeline. The human remains tell their own story. 65 individuals have been excavated, buried in simple graves within and around the settlement structures. The dead were interred in flexed positions, knees drawn to chest, sometimes with grave goods including stone tools, shell beads, and animal bones. One burial contained an elderly woman and a child buried together, positioned in what appears to be an embrace. Medical analysis of the skeletons revealed something unexpected. 3 individuals, 2 adults and a child, showed skeletal lesions consistent with tuberculosis, making these the earliest known cases of the disease in the archaeological record. The presence of TB suggests close quarter living conditions, population, density sufficient for disease transmission, and perhaps trade networks that brought the pathogen from distant regions. Tuberculosis is an opportunistic infection that thrives where humans live in permanent settlements with domesticated animals, exactly the conditions present at Atlit Yam. Other skeletal evidence reveals a population adapted to maritime life. Many individuals show auditory exostosis, bony growths in the ear canal, caused by repeated exposure to cold water. The condition, sometimes called surfer's ear, is diagnostic of frequent diving and swimming. These were people who spent significant portions of their lives in the sea, harvesting shellfish, spearfishing, perhaps even freediving for sponges or other marine resources. The level of investment in infrastructure, the architectural permanence, the communal monuments, all of this points to a stable society that expected to remain in place for generations. Atlit Yam was not a temporary camp, it was a home. So what happened? Geologists studying the site's stratigraphy and the sediments that buried it have proposed a likely scenario. Around 6900 BCE, the settlement was abandoned rapidly, without signs of gradual decline or systematic dismantling. Structures were left intact, wells remained functional, and some artifacts appear to have been left in place mid-use. The abandonment was sudden, suggesting a crisis rather than planned migration. Shortly after the abandonment, the site was inundated by rising sea levels. The Mediterranean has been rising gradually since the end of the last ice age, as glacial meltwater continued to pour into the world's oceans. At the time Atlit Yam was occupied, sea levels were approximately 9 meters lower than today. Over the following centuries, the advancing waterline slowly encroached on the coastal settlement. But rising seas alone do not fully explain the abruptness of the abandonment. Some researchers, including Ehud Galili, have suggested a more immediate trigger, a tsunami. Geological evidence from the eastern Mediterranean indicates a massive submarine landslide occurred on the flank of Mount Etna in Sicily around 6900 to 6800 BCE. The collapse, known as the Etna submarine landslide, displaced an estimated 35 cubic kilometers of material into the sea, generating a tsunami that propagated across the Mediterranean basin. Computer models suggest waves reaching the Levantine coast would have been between 5 and 10 meters high, sufficient to inundate coastal settlements like Atlit Yam with little warning. If a tsunami struck, the residents would have fled inland, taking only what they could carry. When they returned, they may have found their village partially submerged, wells contaminated with salt water, and fields ruined by marine sediment. Rather than rebuild, they relocated permanently to higher ground. The abandoned settlement was then slowly buried by sand and silt, sealed beneath sediment and seawater, its wooden structures waterlogged, its organic materials preserved in anaerobic mud. The Mediterranean became its tomb, and paradoxically, its preservative. Atlit Yam is not unique. It is simply the best preserved and most extensively studied of a growing catalogue of submerged settlements in the Mediterranean basin. Off the coast of Greece, the submerged town of Pavlopetri lies beneath 3 to 4 meters of water near the southern tip of the Peloponnese. First discovered in 1967 and surveyed extensively in 2009 using advanced sonar mapping, Pavlopetri dates to approximately 3000 BCE, making it younger than Atlit Yam, but still extraordinary in its preservation. The town layout is clearly visible on the seafloor. Streets, buildings, courtyards, and tombs arranged in organised blocks. Pavlopetri was not a fishing village, but an urban centre, possibly a trading hub connecting mainland Greece with Crete and the broader Aegean world. Near Alexandria, Egypt, the cities of Heracleion and Canopus rest beneath 10 meters of water, discovered in the 1990s by French marine archaeologist Franck Godiot. These sites are more recent, dating to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, submerged by a combination of sea level rise and land subsidence caused by earthquakes. Yet their submersion illustrates how easily entire cities can vanish beneath the waves, forgotten until sonar and underwater surveys rediscover them centuries or millennia later. In the Adriatic Sea off the coast of Croatia, surveys have identified dozens of submerged settlements dating from the Neolithic through the Roman period. Along Italy's coast, similar sites appear in shallow waters, their stone foundations visible to divers, their artifacts scattered across sandy seabeds. Each discovery confirms the pattern. Coastal settlements thrived during periods of lower sea level, and when the waters rose, those settlements were drowned, buried, and forgotten. Skeptics note that sites like Atlit Yam, while impressive, are only 9,000 years old, well within the established time frame of Neolithic culture. True. But that is precisely the point. If a 9,000-year-old settlement can vanish so completely that we only discovered it 4 decades ago, what about settlements twice or 3 times as old? If rising seas swallowed a village in 9 meters of water, what happened to settlements that were farther out on the exposed continental shelf, now resting beneath 50 or 100 meters, depths where conventional diving is impossible, and surveys require expensive, remotely operated vehicles? Atlit Yam sits in shallow water, easily accessible to divers, close enough to shore that sonar surveys detected it during routine coastal mapping. It was, in archaeological terms, an easy find. The deeper settlements, the ones farther out on the shelf, are not easy finds. They lie beyond the reach of conventional underwater archaeology, in darkness and depth that require technologies most projects cannot afford. If they exist, and statistical probability suggests they must, they remain undetected, unsurveyed, and unacknowledged in the archaeological record. Atlit Yam proves that sophisticated settlements can vanish beneath the waves, their existence erased from human memory until technology reveals their outline. The village demonstrates that Neolithic peoples built monuments, practiced agriculture, developed maritime economies, and created communities complex enough to support specialists, craftspeople, and ritual practitioners. None of this is controversial when applied to Atlit Yam. The evidence is tangible, the dating secure, the interpretation straightforward. But Atlit Yam was occupied when sea levels were only 9 meters lower than today. The final ice age ended 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were 120 meters lower. That is 111 meters of additional exposed coastline, vast swathes of continental shelf now deep underwater, regions where human habitation during the Ice Age is not just possible, but probable. If settlements like Atlit Yam existed 9,000 years ago in relatively marginal coastal environments, what existed 12,000 or 15,000 years ago in the prime coastal zones of the Ice Age? The river valleys and estuaries now submerged beyond diving depth. The question deepens with every discovery. Atlit Yam is a data point, a single site in shallow water. It suggests a pattern that extends outward and downward into depths where no human eye can yet see. What lies beyond diving depth, in the crushing darkness where standard archaeological methods cannot reach? What cities drowned so early that even their names were forgotten, their locations lost, their very existence relegated to myth? To find those answers, we must go deeper. Not 9 meters, but tens of meters, into regions where the continental shelf drops away and where settlements, from the peak of the Ice Age, would now rest unreachable, unmarked, unmapped. We must search for the cities that drowned in the first pulse of flooding, 14,000 years ago, before history began. The Persian Gulf is not supposed to exist. Not as water anyway. Geologists studying the seafloor have found something extraordinary beneath the Gulf's shallow waters. A river system, the paleo-channels of ancient streams that once drained from the mountains of Iran and Arabia into a fertile valley where oil tankers now pass. The Gulf was not always a gulf. It was a river valley, an oasis, a refuge. Some researchers believe it was the garden, the geographic reality behind the oldest flood myths, the place where civilization may have first flourished before the ocean returned to claim it. The evidence begins with bathymetry, the mapping of underwater topography using sonar and satellite altimetry. When marine geologists survey the Persian Gulf floor, they see not a featureless basin, but a landscape, preserved beneath sediment and seawater. Carved into that landscape are unmistakable river channels, meandering paths worn by millennia of flowing water, tributaries branching and converging, exactly as rivers do on dry land. The largest of these paleo-channels has been named the Urshat, from the German for original river. It runs the length of the Persian Gulf, entering from the northwest where the Tigris and Euphrates currently meet, and extending southeast toward the Strait of Hormuz. Along its course, side channels drain from the Zagros Mountains on the Iranian side, and from the Arabian Peninsula on the western side, creating a dendritic pattern identical to modern river systems. These are not subtle features. The main channel is over 100 kilometers wide in some sections, cutting valleys 20 to 30 meters below the surrounding seafloor. The tributary networks are extensive, suggesting a hydrological system that drained an enormous watershed, collecting runoff from highlands that today see minimal rainfall, but during wetter periods sustain substantial water flow. The dating is unambiguous. Sediment cores extracted from the Gulf floor contain layers that tell the story of transition from terrestrial to marine environments. The deepest layers, dating to the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, contain freshwater diatoms, pollen from terrestrial plants, and oxidized soils characteristic of dry land exposed to air. Above these layers, marine sediments begin appearing, first in thin bands indicating seasonal flooding, then continuously as the Gulf filled permanently. The transition occurred between approximately 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, with the final inundation happening rapidly around 8,000 BCE when rising sea levels breached the shallow sill at the Strait of Hormuz and saltwater poured in, converting the valley into the body of water we know today. For most of the last ice age, and into the early Holocene, the Persian Gulf was not water but land, and not marginal land, scrubland barely habitable, but prime territory. During the Ice Age, global climate patterns were profoundly different from today. The monsoon systems that currently bring seasonal rains to much of Asia were weaker or displaced. Many regions experienced aridity, but the Persian Gulf basin, sheltered by surrounding highlands and fed by rivers draining those highlands, would have remained relatively well watered. Paleoclimatic models reconstructing temperature and precipitation patterns for the region between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago consistently show the Gulf Basin as a refugium, an ecological haven in an otherwise harsh environment. The Urshat River system would have sustained riparian forests, wetlands, and grasslands along its banks. Fish and freshwater mollusks would have populated the river. Migratory birds would have followed its course. And for any human populations in the region, this valley would have been irresistibly attractive, offering everything needed for permanent settlement: water, food, transport, and strategic position. Archaeological context deepens the mystery. When we look at the established timeline of Near Eastern civilization, a pattern emerges that has puzzled researchers for decades. Around 10,000 BCE, the archaeological record in Mesopotamia and the Levant shows scattered hunter-gatherer populations living in small temporary camps. They used stone tools, hunted wild game, and gathered wild plants. Their material culture was relatively simple, their social organization seemingly egalitarian and non-hierarchical. Then around 8,000 to 6,000 BCE, something shifts. Agricultural villages appear seemingly abruptly in the highlands of Mesopotamia, the Zagros foothills, and the Levantine corridor. These are not tentative experiments, but fully realized farming communities with domesticated crops, permanent architecture, and evidence of social stratification. The transition from mobile foraging to settled agriculture happens rapidly, far more rapidly than models of gradual cultural evolution would predict. The speed of the transition has led some archaeologists to propose diffusion rather than independent invention, knowledge and practices spreading from a source population to neighbouring groups. But from where? The conventional answer points to the Levant, where early experiments with plant cultivation appear in the archaeological record around 10,000 BCE. Yet even there, the transition seems compressed, as if knowledge appeared rather than developed incrementally. Geoffrey Rose, an archaeologist at the University of Birmingham specialising in Arabian prehistory, has proposed an alternative explanation, the Persian Gulf Oasis theory. Rose argues that during the Ice Age and early Holocene, the exposed Persian Gulf basin was not empty but occupied, potentially home to substantial human populations. These populations would have had access to abundant resources, stable water supplies, and geographic centrality that facilitated interaction and cultural development. In such an environment, agriculture and settled life could have developed gradually over millennia, creating a sophisticated culture in the valley below. When rising seas began inundating the Gulf around 10,000 BCE, the residents would have faced a slow but inexorable crisis. The flooding was not instantaneous but spanned thousands of years, advancing incrementally, season by season, generation by generation. Coastal areas would flood first, then inner valleys, then the entire basin as the sea breached the Hormuz Strait. The inhabitants, watching their homeland disappear, would have migrated outward, moving to higher ground in all directions. North into Mesopotamia, east into Iran, west into Arabia, and potentially by boat to the Indian subcontinent. These refugees would have carried with them the knowledge, practices, and cultural traditions developed over millennia in the now drowned valley. When they encountered highland populations living as hunter-gatherers, the newcomers would have brought a radically different way of life. Agriculture, animal domestication, permanent architecture, and complex social organization. The sudden appearance of these practices in the archaeological record would reflect not local invention, but the arrival of people who already possessed them. This model explains several otherwise puzzling aspects of Near Eastern prehistory. First, the geographic distribution of early agricultural sites. They cluster around the periphery of the Persian Gulf in a rough ring. The Zagros foothills to the northeast, the Levantine corridor to the northwest, and the Arabian Peninsula to the southwest. If agriculture diffused from a single point source, we would expect a core-to-periphery pattern with the oldest sites at the centre. Instead, the pattern suggests dispersal from a now-missing centre, exactly where the Gulf Oasis would have been. Second, the abruptness of the transition. Cultural change typically occurs gradually, with archaeological sites showing incremental development over long time spans. But the shift to agriculture in the Near East appears compressed, as if multiple innovations arrived simultaneously rather than developing in sequence. If refugees from the Gulf brought a fully developed agricultural package, this compression makes sense. Third, the genetic evidence. Population genetic studies of modern humans in the Near East reveal ancient admixture events, moments when distinct populations met and interbred. Some of these admixture signatures date to approximately 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, coinciding precisely with the Gulf flooding. If Gulf populations dispersed into surrounding regions, they would have left genetic traces in the highland groups they encountered. Fourth, and perhaps most compellingly, the flood myths. Sumerian texts, the oldest written records we possess, contain references to events that predate writing itself. The Sumerian King List, a document compiled around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier sources, begins with kings who ruled before the flood. These antediluvian rulers are said to have reigned for impossibly long periods, divine or semi-divine figures governing from cities whose names are given: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. After the flood section, the list resumes with mortal kings ruling mortal lifespans, from cities whose ruins archaeologists have excavated. But the pre-flood cities remain unlocated. Eridu, while identified with a site in southern Iraq, has no archaeological layers old enough to match the mythological timeline. The others are simply absent from the map. Where were the pre-flood cities? If the flood myths preserve memory of the Persian Gulf inundation, then the answer is obvious. They are underwater, beneath 50 meters of salt water and millennia of marine sediment. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE, describes the flood in vivid detail. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a deluge. Ea, the god of wisdom, warns the hero Utnapishtim, who builds a boat and survives the cataclysm. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a mountain, and he releases birds to find dry land. The story parallels dozens of other flood narratives from around the world, but its Mesopotamian setting and its specificity suggest it may be rooted in actual events. If the Gulf flooding occurred over thousands of years rather than days, the myth's compression of time makes sense. Oral traditions condense and dramatize, transforming gradual catastrophe into sudden apocalypse. What matters is not the precise timeline, but the core memory. There was a time when the land existed, then water came and covered it, and survivors fled to the mountains. The Atrahasis epic, another Sumerian flood narrative, adds details that align with the Gulf oasis theory. Before the flood, humans multiply and spread across the land. The noise of their cities disturbs the gods. The flood is sent to reduce their numbers. Afterward, the survivors rebuild in a new land, establishing new cities. The narrative arc matches the proposed sequence: population growth in the Gulf, environmental crisis, flooding, dispersal, and resettlement in new territories. Even the biblical Genesis account, derived from earlier Mesopotamian sources, preserves the pattern. Noah receives warning of the flood, survives by building an ark, and repopulates the earth after the waters recede. The geography is less specific than the Sumerian versions, but the structure is identical: warning, survival, renewal. These are not merely creation myths or moral parables. They are historical memories, passed through generations until codified in writing. Memories of a real landscape, lost to real water. Modern surveys of the Persian Gulf seafloor remain limited. The region is politically sensitive, oil exploration dominates maritime activity, and archaeological priorities are not always aligned with commercial or military interests. What surveys have been conducted focus primarily on mapping hydrocarbon deposits rather than searching for submerged ruins, but even the existing data reveals tantalizing hints. High-resolution bathymetric surveys commissioned by oil companies show geometric anomalies on the seafloor, linear features, and rectangular depressions that do not match natural geological formations. Some appear clustered along the Paleo River channels, exactly where settlements would have been located for access to fresh water and transportation. No archaeologist has yet been able to investigate these anomalies directly. The depth, roughly 50 to 80 meters, in most areas of interest exceeds safe diving limits and requires expensive, remotely operated vehicles or submersibles. The Gulf's waters are murky, visibility is poor, and strong currents complicate underwater work. The sediment load is high, meaning any structures would be buried under meters of silt, invisible without ground-penetrating sonar or physical excavation. Even if funding and access could be secured, interpreting findings would be challenging. Natural geological processes can create patterns that mimic human construction. Confirming artificial origin requires context, artifacts, clear architectural features, things difficult to establish underwater without extensive excavation. Yet the absence of archaeological investigation does not mean absence of sites. It means the sites, if they exist, remain unexplored, their presence suggested by geology and myth, but unconfirmed by physical evidence. The comparison to the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia is instructive. Like the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf was exposed during the Ice Age, creating a massive landmass connecting modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Borneo. When sea levels rose, 1.85 million square kilometers of land vanished beneath the South China Sea and Java Sea. If human populations occupied that land, and they almost certainly did given the favourable environment and the known presence of humans in the region by 50,000 years ago, then evidence of those populations is now underwater. Surveys of the Sunda Shelf have been even more limited than those of the Persian Gulf, but geologists have identified submerged river systems, paleo lakes, and what appear to be artificial stone structures at various depths. Each discovery suggests the shelf was not empty wilderness, but inhabited landscape, home to populations whose names and stories are lost. The Persian Gulf may hold a similar archive. If Rose's theory is correct, beneath the Gulf's waters lie the foundations of what we call civilization, the earliest experiments in agriculture, animal domestication, and urban life, developed not in the highlands where we have been searching, but in the lowlands that no longer exist. The evidence is circumstantial, but accumulating. Favourable environment, geographic centrality, paleo-hydrological systems, the abrupt appearance of agriculture in surrounding regions, genetic admixture events, and most persistently, the flood myths that refuse to fade from cultural memory. Perhaps the search for civilization's origins has been looking in the wrong place, focusing on the mountains where survivors built their new homes, rather than the valleys where their ancestors first gathered. The question is not whether people lived in the exposed Gulf Basin. Given the environment and the timeline, they must have. The question is what they built there, what knowledge they possessed, and what was lost when the ocean returned. The Gulf keeps its secrets beneath silt and salt water, waiting for the technology and will to retrieve them. In Hindu tradition, Krishna's city of Dwarka was swallowed by the sea immediately after his death, its golden towers and harbour walls sinking beneath the waves in a single day. The story appears in the Mahabharata, one of India's two great epics, composed between 400 BCE and 400 CE, but drawing on oral traditions extending back millennia. For most of modern history, scholars treated the submersion of Dwarka as pure mythology, religious allegory about the impermanence of earthly kingdoms and the transition from one cosmic age to another. Then in 2000, marine archaeologists using side-scan sonar detected something unexpected on the seafloor off the coast of Gujarat. Geometric structures, stone blocks arranged in patterns, foundations laid in grids. The structures rest 30 meters underwater, beyond casual diving depth, but accessible to technical divers and remotely operated vehicles. What sonar revealed, subsequent expeditions confirmed. Dwarka, or at least a city in the location where tradition placed Dwarka, exists beneath the Arabian Sea. The underwater investigations began decades earlier, in 1963, when archaeologist S.R. Rao from the Archaeological Survey of India conducted preliminary surveys near the modern town of Dwarka, a pilgrimage site sacred to devotees of Krishna. Rao was not searching for mythological cities, but investigating reports from local fishermen who claimed their nets sometimes snagged on submerged structures offshore. What Rao found surprised him. Using basic diving equipment and visual surveys, he identified stone blocks, wall fragments, and what appeared to be remnants of a harbour infrastructure extending from the shoreline into deeper water. The finds were intriguing but limited by the technology available at the time. Photography was difficult in the murky coastal waters, precise mapping was nearly impossible without GPS or sonar, and the depths prevented extensive exploration. Over the following decades, Rao returned repeatedly, documenting what he could, collecting artifacts washed ashore or retrieved by fishermen, and arguing for more systematic investigation. His work remained marginalized within mainstream archaeology, dismissed by many as wishful thinking driven by religious sentiment rather than scientific rigor. The breakthrough came in the late 1990s and early 2000s when the National Institute of Ocean Technology, a government research organization with advanced marine survey equipment, conducted comprehensive sonar mapping of the Gujarat coast. The institute deployed side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and other acoustic imaging tools designed to penetrate water and sediment to reveal what lies beneath. The results were published in peer-reviewed journals and remained controversial but documented. The surveys detected extensive structures on the seafloor extending over several square kilometers. The anomalies included linear features consistent with walls, rectangular depressions suggesting building foundations, and what appeared to be a grid pattern characteristic of planned urban layout. Subsequent diving expeditions recovered artifacts from the site: pottery fragments, stone anchors with holes drilled through them for rope attachment, sections of what appeared to be dressed stone blocks with flat surfaces and right-angle corners, and pillar fragments carved with decorative patterns. The pottery was analysed and dated using thermoluminescence, a technique that measures when ceramic materials were last heated. Some samples yielded dates around 1500 BCE, placing them in the Late Bronze Age, a period for which archaeological sites are well documented along the Indian coast. These dates were uncontroversial and fit comfortably within known chronology, but other samples produced much older dates. A few pottery fragments and some of the stone artifacts tested returned dates between 7500 and 9500 years old, placing them in the early Holocene, thousands of years before any documented urban civilization in the region. The older dates sparked immediate skepticism. Critics questioned the thermoluminescence methodology, noting that the technique can be unreliable in marine environments where sediment exposure and water saturation affect readings. Others suggested contamination, arguing that older sediments or geological processes could have skewed results. Without corroborating evidence from multiple dating methods, radiocarbon, dendrochronology, or stratigraphic context, the extreme dates could not be confirmed. Proponents countered that dismissing the dates without investigation was premature. If even a fraction of the samples were accurately dated, they pointed to something extraordinary: a coastal settlement predating the earliest known Indian civilizations by millennia. The structures themselves deepened the debate. Marine geologists examining sonar images noted that many features could plausibly be natural. Underwater rock formations, particularly in areas with tectonic activity, can fracture into geometric patterns. Wave action and currents can sort stones into linear arrangements. What appears artificial at first glance may simply be geology shaped by erosion. Yet some features resist natural explanation. The grid pattern detected by sonar, for instance, shows regularities difficult to attribute to chance or erosion. Natural processes tend to produce irregular, organic patterns. Grids suggest planning, intentionality, and human organization. Similarly, the stone blocks recovered by divers show tool marks, flat surfaces that require cutting or dressing, and in some cases, holes drilled with precision for structural purposes. The academic debate remains unresolved. Conservative archaeologists argue that without clear stratigraphic context, without inscriptions or diagnostic artifacts, and without multiple corroborating dating methods, the Dwarka structures could be anything: natural formations, more recent constructions that slumped underwater, or medieval harbour works misidentified as ancient. Alternative researchers argue that the combination of traditional accounts, sonar evidence, recovered artifacts, and at least some radiometric dates pointing to great antiquity warrants serious investigation rather than dismissal. They note that the site has not been systematically excavated, funding for underwater archaeology is limited, and absence of evidence should not be confused with evidence of absence. What both sides What both acknowledge is that something is down there, structures or formations that merit examination, and that the location aligns precisely with where Hindu tradition has always claimed Dwarka once stood. The Mahabharata's description of Dwarka is specific. It describes a city built by the divine architect Vishvakarma on land reclaimed from the sea, with magnificent palaces, wide streets, gardens, and fortified walls. When Krishna dies, the text states that the sea immediately reclaims the city, submerging it completely. The alignment between mythology and underwater findings is striking. Tradition places Dwarka at the western tip of Gujarat. The underwater structures are at the western tip of Gujarat. Tradition says the city was swallowed by the sea. The structures are underwater. Tradition describes stone construction and harbour facilities. Stone blocks and anchor stones have been recovered. The coincidence strains credibility unless the mythology preserves actual memory of an actual place. Dwarka is not the only underwater mystery off India's coast. Farther north, in the Gulf of Cambay between Gujarat and Maharashtra, even more controversial discoveries have emerged. In 2001, marine scientists from the National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted surveys in the Gulf of Cambay, a shallow body of water separating India's western coast from the Kathiawar Peninsula. The Gulf is treacherous for navigation, filled with shifting sandbars and strong tidal currents, making it largely avoided by commercial shipping and rarely surveyed by archaeologists. Using side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profilers, the NIOT team detected what they described as geometric structures on the seafloor at depths between 30 and 40 meters. The sonar images showed rectangular and square patterns, linear features arranged in parallel rows, and what appeared to be building foundations laid out in organized blocks. The lead researcher, S. Badrinarayan, presented the findings at international conferences and in published reports. The acoustic data, he argued, indicated artificial structures covering several square kilometers of seafloor, suggesting not a village but an urban centre, comparable in size to known Bronze Age cities. The claim was explosive. If confirmed, it would push urban civilization in India back thousands of years, predating the Indus Valley civilization and rivaling the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. Artifacts dredged from the area added fuel to the controversy. Pottery fragments, stone tools, fossilized wood, and what appeared to be construction materials were recovered and dated using multiple methods. Some samples produced ages of 7,500 to 9,500 years, the same range as the controversial Dwarka dates. The scientific community responded with skepticism bordering on hostility. Marine geologists reviewing the sonar data argued that the patterns could be natural, riverine deposits, or tidal formations shaped by the Gulf's powerful currents. The acoustic signatures, they noted, were ambiguous, open to interpretation, and without ground truthing through physical excavation, impossible to confirm as artificial. The dating was questioned even more vigorously. Critics pointed out that materials recovered by dredging lack stratigraphic context. A piece of pottery or wood pulled from the seafloor could have originated anywhere, washed in by currents, deposited by rivers, or dating from different periods entirely. Without knowing the exact provenance, the original position within sediment layers, dating individual artifacts, proves nothing about the structures detected by sonar. Furthermore, the Gulf of Cambay sits at the mouth of several major rivers, including the Narmada and Tapti. These rivers have been transporting sediment, organic material, and artifacts from inland sites for millennia. Any dredged material could be riverine, originating hundreds of kilometers upstream and deposited in the Gulf by flood events. The controversy stalled further investigation. Funding was not renewed for systematic excavation. The political and academic climate made the topic radioactive, associated with fringe theories and nationalist agendas rather than sober science. The structures, if they exist, remain unexcavated, documented only by sonar images that are either evidence of lost cities or natural geology, depending on who interprets them. The broader context, however, supports the possibility of ancient coastal settlements in the region, even if specific sites remain unconfirmed. During the last ice age, sea levels around India were 120 meters lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. The entire western coast of India extended hundreds of kilometers farther into what is now the Arabian Sea. The exposed shelf would have been prime territory, coastal plains with access to both marine and terrestrial resources, river valleys draining the Western Ghats, and geographic position facilitating trade and migration. Archaeological sites on land near the coast show continuous human occupation, extending back at least 30,000 years. Stone tool industries, rock art, and evidence of symbolic behaviour indicate sophisticated populations long before the conventional timeline of civilization. If these populations lived primarily on the coast, as populations worldwide tend to do, then their settlements are now underwater. The Sunda Shelf provides a parallel case. In Southeast Asia, the exposed shelf during the Ice Age created a landmass called Sundaland, connecting modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, and mainland Southeast Asia into a single continuous territory. The region is known to have been occupied by humans at least 50,000 years ago, with sophisticated maritime cultures capable of reaching Australia by watercraft. When sea levels rose, Sunda Island was inundated, submerging approximately 1.85 million square kilometres. If permanent settlements existed there, and given the favourable environment and long timeline of occupation they almost certainly did, those settlements are now beneath the South China Sea and Java Sea. Limited surveys of the Sunda Shelf have detected submerged river systems, paleo valleys, and geometric anomalies on the seafloor. Each discovery suggests Sunda Land was not empty but occupied, home to populations whose cultures and cities were erased by the rising ocean. India's continental shelf may tell a similar story. The exposed shelf during the Ice Age would have been larger than modern Pakistan, a habitable zone that disappeared beneath the waves over thousands of years as glaciers melted and seas rose. Populations living there would have faced the same crisis as their counterparts in the Persian Gulf or Sunderland, slow inundation, forcing gradual migration inland. The refugees would have carried their cultural practices, agricultural knowledge, and technological skills into the highlands, encountering and mixing with populations already living there. Genetic studies of Indian populations reveal ancient admixture events, moments when distinct groups intermarried and exchanged genetic material. Some of these events cluster around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, precisely when coastal areas were being inundated. The genetic data does not prove the existence of sophisticated coastal civilizations, but it confirms population movements and mixing during the period when sea level rise would have displaced coastal inhabitants. The mythology reinforces the pattern. Flood legends pervade Indian tradition. The Matsya Purana describes Manu, warned by the god Vishnu in fish form, surviving a great deluge that destroys the world. The story parallels Mesopotamian and other global flood myths, suggesting either cultural diffusion or shared memory of actual events. Other Indian texts refer to sunken cities and lost lands. The Tamil Sangam literature, composed between 300 BCE and 300 CE, mentions Kumari Kandam, a sunken continent south of India that once hosted a great Tamil civilization before being swallowed by the ocean. Modern scholars interpret this as mythologized memory of the exposed continental shelf, Tamil-speaking populations who lived on land now submerged. Whether Dwarka's underwater structures date to 1500 BCE or 9500 BCE remains contested. Whether the Gulf of Cambay sonar images show cities or geology remains unresolved. But the larger question is not whether specific sites are confirmed, it is whether the pattern they suggest is plausible. If sea levels were 120 meters lower 12,000 years ago, then millions of square kilometers of Indian coastline were exposed. If humans occupied India continuously for tens of thousands of years, then they occupied those coasts. If coastal populations developed permanent settlements, as coastal populations tend to do, then evidence of those settlements is now underwater. The logic is unavoidable, even if individual sites remain controversial. Dwarka and the Gulf of Cambay structures represent possibilities, not certainties. They are hints, anomalies that suggest the seafloor may hold more than we have yet confirmed. They remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence would be 30 meters underwater, buried under sediment, and accessible only with expensive technology most projects cannot afford. Mythology sometimes remembers what history forgets. If the stories of submerged cities preserve kernels of truth, if the traditions pointing to specific locations reflect genuine memory rather than invention, then technology may eventually confirm what oral tradition has maintained for millennia. The structures are there, detected by sonar, partially explored by divers, debated by academics. Whether they are natural or artificial, recent or ancient, modest or monumental, remains to be determined. What is certain is that the ocean keeps them, and until systematic excavation occurs, their secrets remain suspended in saltwater and controversy. If mythology sometimes preserves what history forgets, which flood legends do you think might be based on real events? Share your thoughts below, and if you want to continue exploring the ghost cities beneath the waves, subscribe to join us for the journey. The Indian Ocean is vast, but it is not alone in hiding ancient secrets. To the east, where the Sunda Shelf once connected Southeast Asia as a continuous landmass, and to the west across the Atlantic, other underwater mysteries have emerged, each one deepening the question of what disappeared when the seas returned. We turn now to examine the most controversial of these sites, structures so enigmatic that geologists and archaeologists have argued over their origins for decades, unable to agree whether they are carved by human hands or shaped by natural forces. The answer may determine whether our maps of prehistory are incomplete or entirely wrong. Beneath the waves off Japan's Ryukyu Islands lies a formation that defies easy explanation. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered in 1986 by dive instructor Kihachiro Aratake during a routine survey for hammerhead shark observation sites, features terraced platforms descending in steps from shallow water to the seafloor 25 meters below. The structure, if that is what it is, displays right-angle corners, flat surfaces, and geometric precision that some researchers see as unmistakable evidence of artificial construction. Others see only sandstone, carved by erosion and fractured by tectonic forces into patterns that mimic but do not represent human engineering. The debate has raged for nearly 4 decades, and no consensus has emerged. Aratake's discovery was accidental. While searching for dive sites that might attract tourism to Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost inhabited island, he noticed an unusually geometric underwater formation near the southern shore. The structure caught his attention not because of what it was, but because of what it looked like: steps, terraces, and walls arranged in ways that seemed deliberate rather than random. He documented the site with underwater photography and informed Japanese archaeologists and geologists. Within months, researchers began investigating, and the monument, as it came to be called, became one of the most studied and most controversial underwater formations in the world. The structure's dimensions are substantial. It measures approximately 150 meters in length, 40 meters in width, and rises 27 meters from the seafloor to within 5 meters of the surface. The most striking feature is a series of flat terraces separated by vertical walls, creating a stepped appearance reminiscent of ancient pyramids or ziggurats. The terraces occur at regular intervals, approximately every 2 meters of depth, forming 5 distinct levels before reaching the summit platform. Other features complicate the picture. A triangular depression carved into one section resembles a quarry, as if blocks were systematically removed. Linear grooves run parallel across some surfaces, too straight and too evenly spaced to be natural erosion patterns. In one area, what appears to be a carved head or face emerges from the rock. Though whether it represents intentional sculpture or pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns remains disputed. Most provocatively, several passages or tunnels penetrate the structure horizontally, creating chambers accessible to divers. These passages are rectangular in cross-section, with flat ceilings and floors, and extend several meters into the rock before terminating. Natural geological processes can create caves and tunnels, but they typically produce irregular, organic shapes rather than rectangular precision. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has studied the monument for over 3 decades. He argues unequivocally that the structure is artificial, carved or shaped by human hands sometime in the distant past. His evidence rests on several observations that he believes natural processes cannot explain. First, the regularity of the terraces. Kimura notes that the steps occur at consistent heights and widths across the structure, maintaining proportions that suggest intentional design. Natural erosion patterns, he argues, produce irregular features that vary based on rock hardness, water flow, and fracture lines. The Yonaguni terraces show none of this variation. Second, tool marks. Kimura claims to have identified what appear to be cut marks on some stone surfaces, V-shaped grooves consistent with stone tools or wedges used to split rock. He has published photographs of these marks, though other geologists dispute their interpretation, arguing the grooves could be natural joints or fractures in the sandstone. Third, the quarry-like depression. Kimura interprets this feature as evidence of stone extraction, a place where builders removed blocks for use elsewhere. The depression's geometry, he contends, matches quarrying techniques, documented at historical sites in Japan and China. Fourth, adjacent structures. Kimura's surveys have identified other geometric formations near the main monument, including what he describes as roads, walls, and even a carved turtle or tortoise figure. These additional features, he argues, suggest not a single isolated structure, but a complex of connected sites, implying organized construction over an extended period. If Kimura is correct and the monument is artificial, then its age becomes the central question. The structure currently sits at depths that would only have been exposed during the last ice age, when sea levels were substantially lower. Geological evidence indicates the Ryukyu Islands have been tectonically stable, with minimal land uplift or subsidence over the past 15,000 years. If the monument was carved on dry land and later submerged by rising seas, it must predate the end of the Ice Age, making it at least 10,000 to 12,000 years old. Such an age would place the monument among the oldest constructed works on Earth, contemporary with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, but on an island at the edge of the Pacific, far from any known centre of early civilization. The implications would be profound, requiring a fundamental reassessment of human capabilities and cultural development during the late Paleolithic. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, has examined the Yonaguni monument and reached the opposite conclusion. Schoch, known for his work on the Sphinx erosion controversy, approaches the site with expertise in geology and an understanding of how rock weathers under various conditions. Schoch argues that the monument is entirely natural, the product of sandstone fracturing and erosion shaped by tectonic activity and wave action over millennia. Sandstone, he notes, fractures along predictable planes determined by its internal structure, and the stresses it experiences. When these fractures intersect at right angles, as they frequently do in sedimentary rock, the result can be remarkably geometric, creating flat surfaces, straight edges, and even step-like formations. The terraces, according to Schoch, follow natural bedding planes in the sandstone, layers where the rock is weakest and most prone to breaking. Wave action and currents have eroded these planes preferentially, creating the terraced appearance. The regularity of the spacing reflects the uniformity of the bedding planes, not human design. The so-called tool marks, Schoch argues, are natural joints, cracks that form when rock is subjected to stress from tectonic movement or thermal expansion. These joints can be remarkably straight and can intersect to create patterns that resemble cutting or carving, but are purely geological. The quarry-like depression, in Schoch's interpretation, is simply a section where softer rock eroded more rapidly than surrounding areas, creating a hollow. Such differential erosion is common in sedimentary formations and requires no human intervention to explain. Even the passages and tunnels can be accounted for naturally. When sandstone fractures along intersecting planes, the result can be rectangular voids. Water flowing through these fractures can enlarge them over time, creating the chambers that Kimura interprets as rooms or storage areas. Schoch does not dismiss the structure's visual impact. He acknowledges that the monument looks artificial, that its geometry suggests intentionality, and that without geological training, most observers would assume human construction. But appearance, he insists, is not evidence. Geology produces patterns that can fool even experienced researchers, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. The debate between Kimura and Schoch and the broader academic community, aligned behind each position, remains unresolved. Neither side has produced evidence so compelling that the other concedes. Kimura continues to find features he interprets as artificial. Schoch continues to explain them geologically. What both acknowledge is that without clear artifacts, pottery, tools, or inscriptions, the question cannot be definitively answered. If humans carved the monument, they left behind nothing obviously diagnostic. If nature created it, then geology has produced one of its most convincing forgeries. Similar formations exist nearby. Off the coast of Kerama, another island in the Ryukyu chain, divers have documented structures resembling walls, platforms, and even what appears to be a carved stone head. These sites show the same geometric precision and the same interpretive ambiguity. Are they extensions of the Yonaguni complex, evidence of a broader cultural presence in the region? Or are they further examples of how sandstone fractures and erodes in this particular geological and hydrological environment? The pattern extends beyond Japan. Across the Pacific, in the warm waters of the Bahamas, another underwater mystery has provoked decades of debate. The Bimini Road, discovered in 1968 by pilot and amateur archaeologist J. Manson Valentine, consists of a linear arrangement of limestone blocks on the seafloor near North Bimini Island. The blocks, each measuring roughly 3 by 4 meters and up to half a meter thick, are arranged in 2 parallel lines extending approximately 700 meters along the ocean floor, at depths between 3 and 6 meters. The lines are remarkably straight, deviating only slightly over their length, and the blocks fit together with what some researchers describe as precision joinery. Valentine and his supporters argued that the formation represented an ancient road or harbour structure, built by an unknown civilization and submerged by rising sea levels. The alignment, the regularity, and the sheer length of the feature suggested deliberate construction rather than natural accumulation. Geologists studying the site reached a different conclusion. The Bimini blocks, they determined, are beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally in tropical coastal environments. When sand, shells, and organic material accumulate in the intertidal zone, they can cement together under the right chemical conditions, forming solid rock. As sea levels rise, this beach rock becomes submerged, and wave action can fracture it into rectangular blocks along natural joints in the rock. The parallel arrangement, according to this interpretation, reflects the original orientation of the beach rock formation parallel to the ancient shoreline. The joinery results from fracture patterns inherent to the rock structure. What appears as precision construction is coincidence, the alignment of natural features in ways that mimic human engineering. Yet some details resist easy explanation. The blocks show consistent thickness, suggesting selection or shaping rather than random fracturing. Some appear to rest on pillar-like supports, smaller stones positioned beneath them as if to elevate the larger blocks above the seafloor. And the overall pattern, two parallel lines of blocks extending hundreds of meters, strains coincidence, particularly when historical accounts from the region describe submerged ruins seen by early explorers. The debate over Bimini Road mirrors the Yonaguni controversy. Visually compelling features, plausible natural explanations, and insufficient diagnostic evidence to resolve the question definitively. Farther south, off the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys in 2001 detected what researchers described as geometric patterns on the seafloor at depths exceeding 600 meters. Paulina Zelitsky, a marine engineer leading the expedition, reported side-scan sonar images showing rectangular and pyramidal structures arranged in what appeared to be urban layouts, including streets, buildings, and plazas. The depth immediately raised skepticism. At 600 meters, the structures would have been submerged for hundreds of thousands of years, predating anatomically modern humans. Unless the seafloor had subsided dramatically due to tectonic activity, which geological evidence does not support, the formations could not be artificial. Follow-up investigations using remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras produced ambiguous results. Some images showed what appeared to be large stone blocks with flat surfaces and right angles. Others showed only natural rock formations, outcrops of volcanic basalt, fractured by cooling and erosion. The depth, the water clarity, and the limitations of ROV technology prevented conclusive identification. The Cuban structures remain enigmatic but largely dismissed by mainstream archaeology due to the implausibility of the depth and the lack of corroborating evidence. In the Mediterranean, additional sites complicate the picture. Off the coast of Malta, surveys have detected linear stone formations and what appear to be walls or building foundations at depths of 20 to 30 meters. Malta's prehistory includes some of the world's oldest freestanding stone temples, dating to 3600 BCE, so the presence of older submerged structures is plausible. Yet systematic underwater excavation has not occurred, leaving the formations documented but unconfirmed. Near Sicily, sonar surveys have identified geometric anomalies on the seafloor between Sicily and Malta, in a region that would have been a land bridge during the Ice Age. The structures, if artificial, could represent settlements from the period when the Mediterranean was partially isolated from the Atlantic, its water levels lower than today. Off Sardinia, near the island's western coast, divers have reported underwater walls and foundations associated with nuraghi, Bronze Age stone towers that dot the island's landscape. Some nuraghi are clearly submerged by recent coastal subsidence, their age and origin well documented, but others appear older, their architectural styles unfamiliar, their contexts ambiguous. Each site, viewed individually, can be explained away: natural geology, misidentified recent constructions, wishful interpretation of ambiguous features. But collectively, they form a pattern. Underwater structures at predictable depths, corresponding to known periods of sea level rise, distributed across multiple oceans, all featuring geometric precision that challenges natural explanation. Perhaps everyone is natural. Geology, after all, can produce extraordinary patterns, Sandstone terraces, beach rock formations, volcanic jointing, all can create features that mimic human construction without requiring human involvement. Or perhaps we are seeing the scattered evidence of coastal civilizations drowned so long ago that their existence seems impossible, their structures debated rather than accepted, their reality suspended between what geology can explain and what archaeology refuses to believe. The debate will continue until systematic excavation occurs, until diagnostic artifacts are recovered, until something undeniably artificial emerges from the depths. Until then, the structures remain what they have always been: anomalies, provocations, questions carved in stone and submerged in controversy. What is undeniable is that sea levels rose dramatically, and recently in geological terms, that coastlines were radically different during human prehistory, and that absence of confirmed submerged cities does not mean such cities never existed. It may simply mean we have not yet looked hard enough, deep enough, or with the right tools to find them. The ocean keeps both possibilities suspended in its depths, natural wonders or human ruins, waiting for evidence that might never come, or might arrive tomorrow with the next sonar survey. The Gobi Desert was not always empty. Beneath its dunes, satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed the shadows of ancient river systems, dry lake beds, and geometric anomalies that suggest human settlement. Mongolian and Chinese traditions speak of great cities swallowed by advancing sands, places with names like Karakoto and Karakoto, the Black City. Some were documented historical settlements, destroyed by shifting climate and invading armies, their ruins rediscovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century. But older stories whisper of cities that predate history itself, metropolises from when the Gobi was grassland and water flowed, where now there is only stone and dust. The sand does not erase, it preserves, layer upon layer, waiting for wind or technology to reveal what lies beneath. The Gobi spans roughly 1.3 million square kilometers across southern Mongolia and northern China, one of the world's largest cold deserts. Today it receives less than 200 millimeters of rainfall annually in most regions, supporting only sparse vegetation and scattered populations of nomadic herders. But this aridity is recent in geological terms. Paleoclimatic studies using lake sediment cores, fossil pollen, and isotopic analysis of ancient groundwater reveal that the Gobi experienced multiple wet and dry cycles over the past 20,000 years. During wetter periods, the region supported grasslands, woodlands, and extensive river networks draining from the surrounding mountains. Lakes dotted the landscape, some substantial enough to leave behind dry basins visible from orbit today. The most recent wet phase occurred between approximately 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, coinciding with the Holocene climate optimum when global temperatures were slightly warmer than today and monsoon patterns shifted northward, bringing increased precipitation to Central Asia. During this period, the Gobi would have been habitable, capable of supporting agriculture, permanent settlements, and significant human populations. Archaeological evidence confirms human presence. Stone tools, petroglyphs, and burial sites dating to the Neolithic and Bronze Age appear throughout the region, demonstrating that people lived here during the wetter intervals. What remains uncertain is the scale and sophistication of that occupation. Historical records provide tantalizing clues. The most famous buried city of the Gobi is Karakoto, the Black City, a fortified settlement that thrived during the Western Xia dynasty in the 11th to 13th centuries CE. The city was a trading hub on the Silk Road, prosperous and well defended, until Mongol forces under Genghis Khan's grandson besieged it in 1372. According to legend, the defenders diverted the river, supplying the city, intending to flood the Mongol camp, but the plan backfired, leaving Karakoto without water. The city fell, its population massacred or scattered, and the desert reclaimed it. Karakoto lay forgotten until 1909, when Russian explorer Pyotr Kozlov, guided by Mongolian informants and local legends, located the ruins buried under sand dunes in the Ajan-Bana region of Inner Mongolia. Kozlov's excavations recovered an extraordinary cache of artifacts: Buddhist manuscripts, paintings, sculptures, coins, and everyday objects preserved by the desert's dryness. The manuscripts, written in Tangut, the language of the Western Sire, provided invaluable insights into a culture that had been nearly erased from history. The rediscovery of Karakoto proved that cities could vanish beneath desert sands, remaining hidden for centuries until the right combination of knowledge, technology, and determination uncovered them. If a city occupied less than 700 years ago could be so thoroughly buried and forgotten that even its location became legend, what about settlements twice or 3 times as old? Central Asian oral traditions speak of older cities, places that existed before the historical period, before writing and empire. These stories describe fertile lands turned to desert, rivers that dried up, and civilizations that collapsed when the climate changed. The tales are vague, lacking specific dates or locations, preserved through generations as cautionary myths about the impermanence of human achievement. Some traditions mention Shambhala, a legendary kingdom hidden in the mountains or deserts of Central Asia, a place of wisdom and enlightenment that vanished from the world. While Shambhala is primarily a religious and philosophical concept in Tibetan Buddhism, some researchers have speculated that it might be rooted in dim memory of an actual lost civilization, its details mythologized over millennia until history became allegory. Similarly, the legend of Agartha, a subterranean kingdom supposedly located beneath Central Asia, might reflect folk memory of buried cities, settlements covered by sand and forgotten, their existence transmuted into stories of underground realms. These interpretations are speculative, but they illustrate how lost cities can become mythology when memory fades and physical evidence disappears. Farther west, the Taklamakan Desert in China's Xinjiang region has yielded more tangible evidence of vanished civilizations. The name Taklamakan is often translated as place of no return, a reference to the desert's hostility and the ease with which travelers can become disoriented and lost among its endless dunes. Yet beneath those dunes lie the remnants of cities that once thrived along the Silk Road. Nia, Lulan, and Miran were trading centres that flourished between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, oases fed by rivers flowing from the surrounding mountains. When the rivers shifted course or dried up due to climate change or tectonic activity, the cities were abandoned and the desert advanced, burying streets, buildings, and artifacts under sand. The Nia ruins, discovered in the late 19th century, revealed a sophisticated urban centre with Buddhist temples, administrative buildings, and residential quarters. Excavations recovered documents written on wood and silk, providing records of daily life, trade transactions, and legal disputes from nearly 2,000 years ago. The preservation was extraordinary, organic materials surviving because the desert's aridity prevented decomposition. Even more remarkable were the Tarim Basin mummies, discovered in the Taklamakan during the 20th century. These naturally mummified bodies, preserved by the desert's dryness, date to between 1800 BCE and 200 CE. The mummies are notable for their Caucasian features, tall stature, and European clothing styles, suggesting populations of Indo-European origin lived in the region during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Genetic analysis has confirmed European ancestry mixed with East Asian lineages, indicating that Taklamakan was a crossroads where different populations met, traded, and intermingled. The mummies and the buried cities demonstrate that the Taklamakan, now one of the world's most inhospitable deserts, once supported complex societies. The settlements disappeared not because they were primitive or poorly planned, but because the environment changed, rivers dried, and survival became impossible. The pattern repeats across Central Asia. Wherever deserts exist today, paleoclimatic evidence shows they were once wetter, and wherever moisture existed, human settlements followed. The vast majority of these settlements remain unexcavated, their locations unknown, detectable only when sand shifts or remote sensing reveals anomalies beneath the surface. Modern technology has begun changing that. NASA and the European Space Agency have deployed satellites equipped with synthetic aperture radar capable of penetrating sand to detect subsurface structures. These instruments measure minute variations in surface texture and moisture content, revealing buried walls, roads, and building foundations invisible to optical cameras. In the Libyan Sahara, radar surveys have identified extensive networks of structures beneath the sand, including what appear to be fortifications, irrigation channels, and urban layouts. Some of these features correspond to known ancient sites, Roman outposts, and medieval Islamic settlements documented in historical texts. But others have no historical correlation, suggesting they predate written records. The Garamantes civilization, which flourished in southwestern Libya between 500 BCE and 700 CE, provides a well-documented example of sophisticated desert urbanism. The Garamantes built an empire based on control of Saharan trade routes, constructing cities in one of the most arid regions on Earth. Their survival depended on an ingenious system of underground irrigation tunnels called fagaras, which tapped ancient aquifers and transported water to the surface without evaporation losses. Archaeological surveys using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed that the Garamantes urban network was far more extensive than previously understood. Hundreds of settlements, connected by roads and supported by thousands of kilometers of fagaras, covered an area comparable to modern European countries. When climate change and aquifer depletion made the system unsustainable, the civilization collapsed, and the desert buried its remains. The Garamantes are known to history because classical Greek and Roman writers described them. But radar surveys reveal similar structures in regions with no historical documentation, suggesting civilizations rose and fell in the Sahara long before Mediterranean chroniclers took notice. The Sahara itself underwent dramatic climate shifts. During the African humid period, roughly 4,800 to 5,500 years ago, the Sahara was green, a vast savanna dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. This was the same epoch during which the Nile Valley civilizations developed, the same period when the Persian Gulf was flooding, and the same time frame when sea levels were rising globally. The greening of the Sahara was driven by the same orbital and climatic shifts that ended the Ice Age. Monsoon systems intensified, pushing moisture farther north, transforming the desert into grassland. Archaeological evidence shows widespread human occupation during this period. Rock art from the Tassili Nadja in Algeria and the Caucasus Mountains in Libya depicts cattle herding, hunting scenes, and daily life in landscapes that today see virtually no rainfall. When the climate shifted again around 5,500 years ago, the monsoons weakened, the rains ceased, and the Sahara desiccated rapidly. The populations that had thrived there for thousands of years migrated toward the Nile Valley, the Mediterranean coast, and sub-Saharan Africa. Those who remained adapted to desert life as nomads or clustered around the few remaining oases. If permanent settlements existed during the humid period, and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests they did, those settlements are now buried. The advancing sand covered them just as it covered Karakoto and the Silk Road cities, sealing them beneath dunes that shift with the wind but never reveal what lies beneath without deliberate excavation. The challenge is scale. The Sahara covers approximately 9 million square kilometers. Even with satellite imagery, detecting buried structures requires knowing where to look, understanding the patterns of ancient settlement, and distinguishing subtle anomalies from natural geological features. Each potential site requires ground truthing, physical surveys to confirm what sensors suggest, and such surveys are expensive, logistically difficult, and politically complicated in regions spanning multiple countries with varying attitudes toward archaeological research. Desert preservation is a paradox. The same aridity that destroys all life also protects what it buries. Organic materials, which decay within years in humid climates, can last millennia in deserts. Wood, textiles, parchment, and even food remain intact when sealed in sand, providing archaeologists with artifacts that simply do not survive elsewhere. This is why Egyptian tombs yield such extraordinary preservation, why mummies still retain hair and skin, and why documents from ancient libraries can be read thousands of years after they were written. The desert is not a destroyer but a vault, keeping secrets until someone opens it. The cities beneath the sand are there. Karakoto proved it. The Silk Road settlements proved it. The Garamantes proved it. Each discovery confirms that deserts hide rather than erase, and that absence of visible ruins does not mean absence of civilization. What we call empty wasteland may be archaeology's greatest archive, preserving not just centuries, but millennia of human story beneath a thin blanket of dunes. The technology exists to find these cities. Satellites can detect them, radar can map them, and excavation can reveal them. The challenge is not capability, but will. The decision to invest resources in searching for cities that mainstream archaeology does not expect to find. Every year, new sites emerge. A shepherd notices pottery shards eroding from a dune. A geologist studying ancient river systems detects geometric patterns in the sediment. An archaeologist following oral traditions to their source discovers walls protruding from sand. Each find adds to the catalogue of lost places, and each suggests that many more remain hidden. The deserts remember. They hold cities in suspension, waiting for erosion or excavation to reveal what they have kept for millennia. Unlike the ocean, which scatters and corrodes, sand preserves almost perfectly, sealing sites in arid stasis until the moment they are uncovered. But sand is also fragile. Wind shifts dunes, exposing sites for brief periods before burying them again. Modern development, agriculture, and resource extraction disturb buried layers without documentation. Every year, unknown sites are destroyed by construction, mining, or agricultural expansion, their contents lost before they are ever recorded. The window for discovery is finite. As populations grow and deserts are developed, the opportunity to systematically survey and protect buried sites diminishes. What is not found soon may be destroyed before it is known to exist. The cities are there. The challenge is excavation, moving thousands of tons of sand for each site, and accepting that beneath the dunes might lie only ruins, fragments of ordinary life, or might lie proof that our timeline is incomplete, that civilizations thrived in places we have dismissed as perpetual wasteland. Water swallows cities, sand buries them, but a third force erases civilizations more thoroughly than either: sudden catastrophe, not the slow encroachment of dunes or gradual rise of seas, but explosive, violent events that reshape continents overnight. To understand how completely a civilization can vanish, leaving no trace for future generations to interpret, we must understand the catastrophe that may have erased dozens at once, the event that ended the Ice Age and changed the world forever, the moment when the sky fell and fire consumed the earth. Around 12,900 years ago, the sky fell, not metaphorically, but geologically, physically, catastrophically. For the people living beneath it, the event must have seemed like the wrath of gods made manifest, the heavens splitting open, the world ending in fire and flood. What they could not have known, what took modern science decades to piece together, is that the catastrophe was planetary. reshaping continents, extinguishing species, and altering the course of human history. The evidence lies buried in a layer of soil so thin it can be measured in millimeters, yet so distinct it appears across 3 continents. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary layer, and within it they have found the fingerprints of destruction. Nanodiamonds forged in temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, melted glass spherules created by impact shock, magnetic microspherules containing iridium and platinum, elements rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets, and layers of carbon-rich soot-marking wildfires that consumed millions of square kilometers. The data points to an impact event, likely a fragmented comet that exploded over or struck the northern hemisphere around 12,900 years ago, triggering a cascade of environmental catastrophes that would last for more than 1,000 years. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first proposed in 2007 by physicist Richard Firestone and a team of researchers from multiple institutions, remains controversial within the scientific community, not because the evidence is absent, but because its implications are so profound that accepting them requires rewriting established models of Ice Age climatology, human prehistory, and the mechanisms of sudden climate change. The hypothesis begins with observation. In the 1980s and 1990s, geologists studying ice cores from Greenland and lake sediments from North America noticed something unusual: a thin black layer marking the transition between the Pleistocene and the Holocene epochs, the boundary between the Ice Age and the modern climate. The layer was consistently dated to approximately 12,900 years before present, and its sudden appearance coincided with an abrupt return to near-glacial conditions after a warming trend had begun. This cold snap, known as the Younger Dryas after an Arctic wildflower that became widespread during the period, lasted roughly 300 years before temperatures rose again, and the modern Holocene climate stabilized. The cause of the Younger Dryas had long been attributed to changes in ocean circulation, specifically the disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation by meltwater from retreating glaciers. The theory was plausible and widely accepted, but it did not fully explain the rapidity of the onset or the global synchronicity of the effects. When researchers began analyzing the composition of the boundary layer more closely, using techniques developed for studying meteorites and impact craters, they found materials that should not have been there. Nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals of carbon, were present in concentrations far exceeding background levels. These diamonds form only under extreme pressure and temperature, conditions found in impacts, nuclear explosions, or deep within the Earth's mantle. Their presence in surface sediments suggested a sudden, violent event capable of generating such conditions. High-temperature spherules, tiny beads of melted material ranging from glass to iron-rich compositions, appeared in the layer. These spherules show magnetic properties and contain cosmic materials, including iridium, osmium, and platinum, in ratios matching extraterrestrial sources rather than terrestrial geology. The melting temperatures required to form them exceed 2000 degrees Celsius, far hotter than any natural terrestrial process except volcanism. Yet the spherules are geographically distributed across regions with no volcanic activity. Carbon spherules, resembling industrial byproducts like those from coal combustion, but predating human industry by millennia, indicate massive combustion events. Alongside these spherules, researchers found layers of soot and charcoal representing continent-scale wildfires. The carbon concentration in the boundary layer is consistent with the burning of approximately 10 million square kilometers of biomass, an area roughly the size of Canada and the United States combined. Shocked quartz, a form of quartz with distinctive fracture patterns created only by the intense pressures of impacts or nuclear explosions, appears in some samples from the boundary layer. While not as widespread as other markers, its presence in multiple locations across North America strengthens the case for a high-energy event. The geographic distribution of these materials is striking. The boundary layer has been identified at more than 50 sites across North America, from Alaska to Mexico, and across the Atlantic in Western Europe, the Middle East, and even in Greenland ice cores. The synchronicity of the layer's appearance, dated consistently to 12,900 years ago across all sites, indicates a single event or series of closely timed events, rather than multiple unrelated occurrences. Proponents of the impact hypothesis, including Alan West, James Kennett, and a growing number of geologists, chemists, and physicists, interpret this evidence as indicating a fragmented comet that broke apart in Earth's atmosphere or upon impact, distributing debris across the northern hemisphere. The comet fragments would have created airbursts similar to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, where an asteroid or comet exploded in the atmosphere with the force of 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Multiply that effect by dozens or hundreds of fragments distributed across a continent, and the scale of destruction becomes unimaginable. The immediate effects would have been catastrophic. Airbursts generating shockwaves, and thermal pulses hot enough to ignite vegetation. Wildfires spreading across forested regions, consuming everything in their path, the atmosphere filling with smoke and ash, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. Glaciers, which had been retreating as the climate warmed, suddenly stabilizing or even advancing again as the planet entered a mini ice age. But the secondary effects may have been even more devastating, particularly for coastal populations. The impact or impacts destabilized the massive ice sheets covering North America. The Laurentide ice sheet, which stretched from the Arctic to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic to the Rockies, contained enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by 50 meters if it melted completely. The sudden injection of heat from the impacts and the subsequent wildfires accelerated melting in the southern portions of the ice sheet, creating catastrophic floods as ice dams failed and glacial lakes burst. The most dramatic example is the channeled Scabberlands of eastern Washington state. This landscape, characterized by deep gorges, massive waterfalls, and chaotic terrain, was carved by repeated megafloods during the late Pleistocene. The floods originated from Lake Missoula, a glacial lake in Montana that periodically burst through ice dams, releasing volumes of water comparable to the flow of all the world's rivers combined, concentrated into a matter of days. Geologist J. Harlan Bretz first proposed the megaflood origin of the Scablands in the 1920s, a theory initially rejected because it seemed too catastrophic, too sudden, too biblical. Decades of subsequent research confirmed Bretz was correct. The Scablands were indeed carved by water, by floods so massive they defy conventional understanding of geological processes. Multiple megafloods occurred, each one releasing between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of water in catastrophic surges that moved house-sized boulders, stripped away hundreds of meters of sediment, and carved channels through solid basalt. The timing of these floods, according to recent dating studies, clusters around the younger Dryas boundary, suggesting the impact event may have triggered a cascade of ice dam failures across the North American ice sheet. When these meltwater surges reached the ocean, they did not disperse gradually, but created regional sea level pulses, sudden rises that would have inundated coastal regions with little warning. Meltwater Pulse 1A, dated to approximately 14,600 years ago, raised global sea levels by 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. Some studies suggest the rise was even more rapid, concentrated into a century or less in certain regions. For coastal populations living on the exposed continental shelves, these pulses were apocalyptic. Shorelines that had been stable for millennia suddenly advanced inland at rates visible within a human lifetime. Villages and settlements built near the coast would have been inundated, forcing populations to retreat or drown. There would have been no time to organize, no opportunity to document what was lost, no possibility of preserving the structures and cities that took generations to build. Archaeological sites along coastlines worldwide show abandonment patterns clustering around periods of rapid sea level rise. At Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the world's oldest known villages, excavations revealed a settlement occupied continuously from 13,000 to 7,000 years ago. Within the Younger Dryas boundary layer at the site, researchers found the same markers of catastrophe: high-temperature spherules, melted glass, and evidence of intense fires. The layer corresponds to a period when the village was temporarily abandoned before being reoccupied centuries later by people with different cultural practices and technologies. The impact event, if it occurred as evidence suggests, did not merely cause fires and floods. It extinguished entire species. Approximately 35 genera of large mammals in North America, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats and dire wolves, disappeared at the Younger Dryas boundary. The extinction was sudden and comprehensive, affecting animals across diverse habitats, from the Arctic to the tropics. Genetic studies of surviving species show population bottlenecks dating to the same period, moments when populations crashed to a fraction of their former size, surviving through only a handful of individuals. The bottlenecks appear in bison, horses, caribou, and other species that survived the extinction, but barely. The Clovis culture of North America, characterized by distinctive spear points and widespread distribution across the continent, vanishes from the archaeological record at precisely the Younger Dryas boundary. Sites occupied by Clovis peoples show sudden abandonment, with no gradual transition to successor cultures. When human populations reappear in the archaeological record centuries later, they use different technologies, occupy different regions, and show cultural discontinuity with the Clovis tradition. The pattern suggests not migration, but catastrophe. Populations so reduced by environmental collapse that cultural continuity was severed. The debate over the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis centers not on whether something dramatic happened. Mainstream science accepts that the Younger Dryas cooling was abrupt and severe, but on the cause. Critics argue that the evidence for impact is circumstantial, that nanodiamonds and spherules can form through other processes, that wildfires can occur without impacts, and that no definitive impact crater has been identified corresponding to the boundary date. Proponents counter that impact craters from airbursts are difficult to identify, that the Tunguska event left no crater despite its destructive power, and that a fragmented comet distributing debris across a wide area would not produce a single identifiable crater. They point to the Hiawatha crater in Greenland, a 31-kilometer-wide impact structure discovered beneath the ice sheet in 2018 as a potential smoking gun. Preliminary dating suggests the crater could be Younger Dryas age, though confirmation requires additional study. The debate will continue, but the boundary layer remains, a thin black line in the Earth's stratigraphy marking a moment of transformation. Whether caused by impact, volcanic eruptions, or some combination of factors, the Younger Dryas represents a planetary reset, an event so catastrophic that it redefined landscapes, climates, and the trajectory of life on Earth. For any coastal civilizations that existed before the catastrophe, the odds of survival were minimal. Fire would have consumed their forests and fields. Smoke would have darkened the sky for months or years. Temperatures would have plunged, killing crops and animals. And finally, as the ice destabilized, floods would have surged across the lowlands, drowning whatever the fire had spared. Survivors would have fled inland, carrying only memories and the knowledge they could preserve through oral tradition. When they reached the highlands and encountered populations that had been sheltered from the worst effects by geography or luck, they would have told stories of the world that ended, of fire from the sky and water from the earth, of cities swallowed and lands drowned. Those stories, passed through generations, would eventually become the flood myths that appear in every culture. The tales of divine punishment, catastrophic deluge, and a handful of survivors chosen to rebuild. The myths are not fiction. They are memory, compressed and mythologized, but rooted in events that actually occurred. The Younger Dryas impact, if it happened as evidence suggests, answers the question that began this investigation. Where are the Ice Age cities? They were destroyed. Fire consumed them. Water scattered them. Sediment buried them. And time, that most thorough of erasers, removed even the memory of their names. The ghost civilizations are ghosts not because they never existed, but because the catastrophe that destroyed them was so complete that only the hardest materials survived. Stone monuments that might be mistaken for natural formations, flood myths that might be dismissed as religious allegory, and scattered evidence beneath oceans, and deserts waiting for technology capable of revealing it. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of erasure. And erasure, when thorough enough, leaves only silence, the same silence that surrounds the Younger Dryas boundary layer, a thin black line marking the moment when the world nearly ended and everything had to begin again. Understanding how civilizations vanish makes their absence less mysterious, but it also makes their traces more precious, because some evidence did survive, not in cities or documents, but in something more durable than stone, memory. Encoded not in buildings, but in the stories humans tell across generations, preserved in the only medium that outlasts disaster, the human voice-speaking traditions that refuse to die. The survivors carried something forward, fragments of knowledge and warning woven into myth, ritual, and the oldest narratives our species maintains. We turn now to those myths, to examine what they remember and whether the stories we dismiss as fantasy might be the last testimony of worlds that drowned. Every culture remembers a flood. The details differ. Gods change names, boats become different shapes, mountains vary in location, but the core narrative remains identical across continents and millennia. A great deluge destroyed an earlier world, and a handful of survivors carried humanity forward into a diminished age. Sumerian cuneiform tablets, inscribed 4,000 years ago, tell of Ziusudra, warned by the god Enki to build a boat before the waters came. Hebrew scripture, drawing on earlier Mesopotamian sources, speaks of Noah and his ark, carrying pairs of animals through 40 days of rain. Hindu texts describe Manu, the first man, saved by a fish that grows enormous and tows his vessel to a mountain peak where the waters recede. Greek mythology remembers Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive Zeus's flood by building a chest and drifting until they reach Mount Parnassus. Chinese tradition recounts Gun Yu, who tames the Great Flood through engineering and perseverance, creating channels to drain the waters. Maya codices speak of Heart of Sky, pouring down endless water upon the wooden people, destroying them utterly. The Popol Vuh describes multiple world ages, each ending in catastrophe, including one annihilated by a great flood that turned the earth to pitch. Indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories, preserved orally for thousands of years, tell of seas rising and swallowing coastal lands, forcing ancestors to flee to higher ground. Pacific Islander traditions from Polynesia to Melanesia describe islands drowning and populations dispersing across the ocean in canoes. The geographic distribution is complete. Every inhabited continent, every major culture, every surviving oral tradition contains some version of the same story. Water came. The world changed. We survived to tell the tale. The coincidence strains belief. Either hundreds of cultures independently invented identical catastrophe myths, a parallel evolution of narrative driven by universal human psychology, or they are all remembering the same event, filtered through different cultural lenses, but pointing to a shared trauma embedded so deeply in collective memory that it survived the transition from oral tradition to written record. The academic debate over flood myths has continued for more than a century. The dominant interpretation, rooted in psychoanalytic and structuralist approaches, treats the stories as archetypal myths, psychological projections of human anxieties about chaos, order, and renewal. Carl Jung proposed that flood myths emerge from the collective, unconscious, universal symbols, representing spiritual rebirth and psychological transformation. Claude Lévi-Strauss argued they reflect structural patterns in human thought, binary oppositions between culture and nature, order and chaos, resolved through narrative. These interpretations are sophisticated and compelling, explaining why flood myths feel universal without requiring actual universal flooding. Humans everywhere face water in its destructive aspects: flash floods, storm surges, tsunamis, and it is natural that these experiences would generate cautionary tales scaled to cosmic proportions. Yet this explanation falters when examined against the specificity and consistency of the myths. The stories are not merely about water as a destructive force. They describe a particular sequence: warning, construction of survival vessel, drowning of the world, landing on a mountain, renewal through survivors. The repetition of this sequence across unconnected cultures suggests either remarkable coincidence or shared memory of actual events. The geological correspondence deepens the mystery. The time frame embedded in many flood myths aligns with known periods of catastrophic sea level rise. When myths can be dated, either through associated astronomical observations or through cultural chronologies preserved in king lists and genealogies, they cluster around 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, precisely the period of rapid meltwater pulses and the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The Sumerian king list, one of humanity's oldest surviving historical documents, divides history into two epochs: before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian kings are said to have ruled for impossibly long periods, divine or semi-divine figures governing from cities that have never been archaeologically located. After the flood, the list resumes with mortal kings ruling mortal lifespans from cities whose ruins archaeologists have excavated. The division is not arbitrary. It marks a fundamental discontinuity, a before and after so profound that later cultures remembered it as the boundary between mythic time and historical time. If the flood represents the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the subsequent sea level rise, then the antediluvian kings may represent leaders of societies that existed during the Ice Age, their cities now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf or scattered across the Mesopotamian plain. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier oral traditions, provides the most detailed Mesopotamian flood account. The gods, disturbed by human noise and overpopulation, decide to destroy humanity with a deluge. Ea, the wise god, warns Utnapishtim, instructing him to build a boat, seal it with pitch, and bring aboard his family and representatives of all living creatures. The flood comes. For 6 days and 7 nights, rain falls in torrents. The storm is so violent that even the gods are terrified, cowering like dogs. When the waters finally recede, the boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush. Utnapishtim releases a dove, which returns finding no land. He releases a swallow, which also returns. Finally, he releases a raven, which does not return, indicating dry land has appeared. The narrative details suggest eyewitness testimony compressed through generations of retelling. The 6 days of rain, the mountain landing, the progressive bird releases to test for land. These are practical details. The observations of someone who experienced gradual flooding and watched for signs of its recession. The biblical Genesis account, written much later but clearly derived from the same Mesopotamian tradition, preserves the same structure. Noah warned, ark built, 40 days of rain, waters prevail, 150 days. Ark rests on Mount Ararat. Birds sent to find land, covenant established afterward. The numbers differ, but the sequence is identical. The Atrahasis epic, another Mesopotamian text, adds details that align with environmental collapse scenarios. Before the flood, humans multiply and spread across fertile lands. Their cities grow noisy. The gods, disturbed, send plagues and drought to reduce populations. When these fail, they resort to the flood. After the deluge, survivors rebuild in new territories, establishing new cities and renewing civilization. The pattern matches the proposed sequence of Ice Age coastal expansion, Younger Dryas catastrophe, sea level rise, and population dispersal to highlands. The myth preserves the arc of expansion, crisis, and recovery that geological and archaeological evidence suggests actually occurred. Hindu cosmology places the flood within a cyclical framework of creation and destruction. The Matsya Purana describes Manu, warned by Vishnu in the form of a fish, building a boat and surviving the deluge. After the flood, Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race, the sole survivor carrying forward the knowledge of the previous age. The fish grows enormous, towing Manu's boat through the rising waters until it reaches the Himalayan peaks. When the waters recede, Manu descends from the mountain and begins the work of repopulation and cultural restoration. The story emphasizes continuity through catastrophe, knowledge preserved and transmitted by a survivor who bridges the old world and the new. Greek mythology, while later and more literary than Near Eastern traditions, preserves similar motifs. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned by his father that Zeus plans to flood the earth to punish human wickedness. Deucalion builds a chest, enters it with his wife Pyrrha, and floats for 9 days before landing on Mount Parnassus. When they emerge, the world is empty. An oracle instructs them to throw stones over their shoulders, and from these stones, new humans arise. The detail of stones becoming people is clearly mythological embellishment, but the core sequence matches other traditions: warning, construction, floating, mountain landing, renewal. Chinese flood myths differ in emphasis, but retain the essential narrative. Rather than divine punishment, the Chinese tradition describes Gun Yu, a cultural hero who controls the Great Flood through engineering. Gun attempts to dam the waters, but fails. His son Yu succeeds by creating channels to drain the floodwaters into the sea, establishing river systems and making the land habitable again. The emphasis on human agency and engineering reflects Chinese cultural values, but the underlying story, a great flood reshaping the world, remains consistent. In the Americas, flood traditions are pervasive. The Aztec creation myth describes 5 world ages, each ending in catastrophe. The 4th age ends when the sky rains fire and water, transforming humans into fish. The Maya Popol Vuh describes the gods creating and destroying multiple versions of humanity. One version, annihilated by a flood that turns the world black with resin. North American indigenous traditions contain dozens of flood narratives. The Ojibwe tell of the Great Flood survived by Nanabojo, who recreates land by sending animals diving for mud from beneath the waters. The Hopi speak of emergence from underground worlds after floods destroy previous civilizations. The Cree remember a time when waters covered everything, and only those who reached the highest mountains survived. Indigenous Australian stories, some of the world's oldest oral traditions, describe coastal lands submerged by rising seas. The Yolngu people of northern Australia tell of the land bridge to Papua New Guinea, now drowned beneath the Torres Strait. The Narunga people of South Australia describe Kangaroo Island separating from the mainland as seas rose. These stories, once dismissed as mythological, have been confirmed by geological evidence, showing the events they describe occurred 7,000 or to 10,000 years ago, well within the time span that oral traditions can preserve. Linguist Nicholas Reed and geographer Patrick Nunn have documented over 24 Australian Aboriginal stories describing specific coastal landscapes now submerged. By comparing the stories with bathymetric data and sea level rise chronologies, they confirmed that the stories accurately describe real places drowned by real flooding. The stories are not myths but memories, preserved with remarkable fidelity across hundreds of generations. This raises a profound question about oral tradition's capacity to preserve factual information. Western scholarship has long assumed that oral cultures cannot maintain accurate historical records beyond a few centuries, that stories inevitably become corrupted, embellished, or transformed into pure fiction over time. But indigenous communities worldwide have maintained that their stories are true, that they describe real events and real places, and that dismissing them as mere folklore is a form of cultural arrogance. The Australian evidence supports their claims. If Aboriginal traditions can accurately preserve memories of events 10,000 years ago, then other oral traditions might possess similar capacities. The flood myths, then, may not be psychological archetypes or religious allegories. They may be history, the only history that survived the catastrophes that destroyed the physical evidence. Beyond the flood itself, many traditions describe culture bringers, mysterious teachers who arrived after the deluge to instruct survivors in agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and civilized arts. These figures appear in myths worldwide, and their common characteristics suggest either cultural diffusion or shared memory of actual knowledge bearers. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu, 7 sages sent by the god Ea, emerge from the sea before the flood to teach humanity. After the flood, their knowledge becomes the foundation of Sumerian civilization. The Apkallu are depicted as fishmen, beings who straddle the boundary between the watery chaos and human order. Oannes, described by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BCE, is one such figure. He rises from the Persian Gulf each day to teach people writing, agriculture, and the arts of civilization, then returns to the sea each night. The description sounds fantastical, but if interpreted as a cultural memory of survivors from drowned coastal settlements teaching inland populations, it becomes plausible. In South America, Viracocha appears in Andean mythology as a bearded figure, dressed in white, who travels the land teaching agriculture and architecture. He arrives after a great flood destroys an earlier world, bringing knowledge that allows survivors to rebuild. The Inca, when Spanish conquistadors arrived, initially believed them to be Viracocha returning. A tragic misidentification, but one that reveals how deeply the culture-bringer myth was embedded in Andean consciousness. Quetzalcoatl, in Mesoamerica, plays a similar role, a wise teacher associated with wind, learning, and the arts of civilization. He arrives from the east, across the water, brings knowledge, and eventually departs with a promise to return. The myth varies across Maya, Aztec, and Toltec cultures, but the core motif remains. Knowledge comes from a stranger who appears after catastrophe. In Egypt, Thoth or Jehuti, the god of wisdom, writing and magic, is associated with the restoration of order after chaos. Priestly texts describe Thoth as the scribe who records the judgments of the dead and the keeper of sacred knowledge. Some Egyptologists have noted that Thoth's attributes suggest he may represent the personification of knowledge preserved from an earlier era, a cultural memory of scribes or priests who brought learning forward through catastrophe. These culture-bringer myths share a pattern. They appear after destruction. They come from across water. They teach practical skills rather than abstract philosophy, and they establish the foundations of civilization before departing. If interpreted as memory rather than fantasy, they describe exactly what would happen if survivors from more advanced coastal societies encountered less developed inland populations after the flooding. The coastal refugees would possess knowledge of agriculture, developed over millennia In fertile river valleys, seafaring skills, architectural techniques, and possibly astronomical observations accumulated over generations. To inland populations living as hunter-gatherers, these refugees would seem almost magical, bringing techniques and knowledge that transformed life overnight. Over centuries, as the actual events faded from memory, the refugees would be mythologized, transformed from human teachers into divine beings, but the memory of what they taught would remain embedded in cultural practice and oral tradition. The myths are not history in the modern sense. They lack dates, precision, documentation, and verifiable facts. But they are memory, the deep memory of traumatic events that shaped entire populations. When those populations were scattered by catastrophe, they carried the stories with them, adapting details to local contexts, but preserving the core narrative. If ghost civilizations existed during the Ice Age, flourishing on coasts now drowned and plains now deserts, then the flood myths are not psychological projections or religious allegories. They are the last testimony of those civilizations, the only record that survived when stone foundations were submerged, when archives were destroyed, when names were forgotten. The myths are their epitaph, written not in language, but in narrative, preserved not in monuments, but in memory, transmitted not through documents, but through the human voice, speaking across millennia. The flood myths may be the truest history we possess of the Ice Age world, more reliable than archaeology, because they survived when physical evidence could not, carried forward by survivors who refused to let their ancestors be forgotten, who insisted that, yes, there was an earlier world, yes, it was destroyed by water, and yes, we are the descendants of those who lived through it. Perhaps we do not tell these stories because we need psychological comfort or religious meaning. Perhaps we tell them because they are true, because they describe what actually happened, and because forgetting them would mean losing the last connection to worlds our distant ancestors inhabited before the catastrophe, before history began, before the flood. Civilizations leave traces even when their cities vanish. In our DNA, geneticists find bottlenecks, moments when human populations collapse dramatically, survivors carrying forward a reduced genetic diversity that marks catastrophe as clearly as any burnt layer in soil. In our languages, linguists find connections that should not exist, cognates between isolated tongues separated by oceans, suggesting contact before continents, divided or common ancestry from a language now extinct. And in our oldest monuments, engineers find knowledge that appears fully formed, astronomical precision without precedent, mathematical, constants embedded in structures built before mathematics was supposedly invented, architectural techniques with no visible development phase. These anomalies whisper of inheritance, of knowledge carried forward from somewhere earlier, somewhere lost. The ghost civilizations did not vanish completely. They dissolved into us, their genetic signatures preserved in our chromosomes, their words hidden in our vocabularies, their engineering principles encoded in the monuments that still stand. We are their descendants, their libraries, their final archive. The genetic evidence begins with population bottlenecks, dramatic reductions in genetic diversity that occur when populations crash to a fraction of their former size, surviving through only a handful of breeding individuals. These bottlenecks are detectable in modern DNA through analysis of mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, and Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son. Both accumulate mutations at predictable rates, creating molecular clocks that date when populations expanded, contracted, or divided. Multiple bottlenecks appear in human genetic history. The most famous is the Toba bottleneck, dated to approximately 70,000 years ago and potentially caused by the eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia, a volcanic event so massive it may have reduced global human populations to as few as 10,000 individuals. The genetic evidence for this bottleneck is controversial, with some researchers arguing the population reduction was less severe than initially proposed, but the molecular signature remains, a moment of constriction in the human family tree. More relevant to the question of lost civilizations is a later bottleneck, dated to approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, coinciding precisely with the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the subsequent environmental upheavals. Genetic studies of modern populations from Europe, Asia, and the Americas show reduced diversity in lineages dating to this period, suggesting populations were severely stressed, experiencing high mortality and reduced reproduction. The pattern appears in multiple lineages. European mitochondrial haplogroups show expansion after 12,000 years ago, consistent with population recovery following a crash. Asian Y chromosome lineages display similar signatures. In the Americas, Native American populations carry genetic markers indicating they descend from a small founding group that entered the continent and then experienced dramatic population fluctuations during the late Pleistocene. These bottlenecks do not prove the existence of advanced civilizations, they merely confirm that something catastrophic occurred during the period when such civilizations, if they existed, would have been destroyed. But when combined with other evidence, the genetic data supports the narrative of widespread population collapse, followed by recovery and migration. Ancient DNA studies extracting genetic material from skeletal remains thousands of years old have revealed surprising patterns of population movement and mixing during the post-Ice Age period. In Europe, Neolithic farmers migrating from Anatolia and the Levant beginning around 8,000 years ago carried genetic markers distinct from the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations. When the two groups met, they interbred, creating the admixed populations that would eventually become modern Europeans. Similar admixture events occurred in South Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East during the same time frame, approximately 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. These were not isolated encounters, but widespread phenomena, suggesting large-scale migrations triggered by environmental changes. If coastal populations were displaced by rising seas, they would have migrated inland, encountering and mixing with highland groups, exactly as the genetic data indicates. The direction of genetic flow is also revealing. In many regions, the incoming populations carried genetic markers associated with lighter skin, lactose tolerance, and other adaptations to agricultural lifestyles. These traits spread rapidly through populations that had been hunter-gatherers, suggesting the newcomers brought not just genes, but knowledge, agricultural practices that required physiological adaptations to maximize their benefits. Lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood, is particularly interesting. The genetic mutation enabling this trait appears to have been strongly selected for in populations adopting dairy farming around 10,000 years ago. The speed of its spread, reaching near fixation in some populations within a few thousand years, indicates powerful selective pressure, likely because dairy products provided crucial nutrition during the transition to agriculture. If dairy farming was introduced by migrants rather than invented independently, the genetic signature would reflect both population mixing and cultural transmission. The linguistic evidence is more controversial but equally provocative. Languages evolve constantly, changing pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary at rates that make reconstructing deep linguistic history difficult. Beyond approximately 6,000 to 8,000 years, linguistic relationships become speculative, the signal lost in noise. Yet certain patterns suggest deeper connections. The Indo-European language family, which includes most languages of Europe, Iran, and northern India, is estimated to have diverged from a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European, sometime between 6,000 and 4,000 BCE. The homeland of this ancestral language remains debated, with competing theories placing it in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, Anatolia, or the Armenian highlands. What is less debated is that Indo-European expansion coincides with agricultural spread, and according to some researchers, with population movements following environmental pressures. If Proto-Indo-European speakers were displaced from a now submerged homeland, perhaps the exposed shelves of the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, their dispersal would have carried linguistic innovations across Eurasia, creating the family of related languages we observe today. More controversial are proposed superfamilies linking language groups that conventional linguistics considers unrelated. The Nostratic hypothesis, for instance, suggests that Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Uralic, and several other families descend from a single ancestral language spoken 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. The evidence is thin, based on a few hundred proposed cognates that critics argue could be chance resemblances or borrowings rather than genetic inheritance. Yet the possibility remains intriguing. If a widespread population existed during the Ice Age, speaking a language or group of related languages, and if that population was scattered by the Younger, Dryas catastrophe and subsequent flooding, their linguistic descendants would appear as distant relatives, connected by ancient roots, but diverged through millennia of isolation. Language isolates, tongues with no known relatives add another layer of mystery. Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees, has no clear connection to any other language. Sumerian, the language of the world's first known literate civilization, has no relatives among Semitic or Indo-European languages. These isolates could be survivors of language families that otherwise went extinct, the last speakers of traditions that vanished with the cultures that created them. Some researchers have proposed that language isolates might represent pre-flood languages, tongues spoken by populations that survived catastrophe but were largely displaced or absorbed by later migrants. The evidence is speculative, but the pattern is suggestive. Isolated languages in regions that would have been refugia during environmental upheaval, mountains and highlands where populations could have survived when lowlands flooded. The architectural evidence is perhaps the most tangible and most disputed. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 9500 BCE, features massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, each pillar weighing up to 20 tons and decorated with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The site predates agriculture in the region, predates pottery, and predates any other known monumental architecture by thousands of years. What makes Göbekli Tepe so perplexing is its apparent lack of precedent. The stoneworking techniques are sophisticated, requiring knowledge of quarrying, transport, and erection that conventional models suggest should have developed gradually over centuries of experimentation. Yet no earlier sites show this developmental process. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed, as if the knowledge required to build it was imported rather than invented. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated the site, noted that the builders displayed skills that typically require long cultural development: the precision of the stone carving, the organizational capacity to mobilize labor for such large projects, and the symbolic complexity of the iconography all suggest a mature culture, not an initial experiment. If the builders were descendants of populations displaced from more favorable environments where such skills had developed over millennia before being brought to the highlands, the sudden appearance makes more sense. Similar patterns appear worldwide. Megalithic construction techniques, the ability to quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing hundreds of tons, appear in multiple regions during the early Holocene without clear precedents. The techniques vary by region, using different stone types and architectural styles, but the underlying principles, selecting appropriate stone, shaping it with precision, moving it over distances, and positioning it accurately, are consistent. At Baalbek in Lebanon, trilithon blocks weighing approximately 800 tons form the foundation of the Temple of Jupiter. The Romans, who built the visible temple, left no explanation for how or why they used such massive stones, when smaller blocks would have sufficed. Some researchers suggest the Romans built atop an earlier foundation, inheriting megalithic construction from a predecessor culture whose identity remains unknown. In South America, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and other Andean sites display stonework so precise that joints are measured in fractions of millimeters. The Inca, when questioned by Spanish chroniclers about these structures, reportedly stated they did not build them, but found them already ancient, attributing them to Viracocha or earlier peoples. Whether these attributions reflect genuine historical memory or cultural modesty is debated, but the technical sophistication of the stonework is undeniable. The stones are not merely stacked but interlocked in complex polygonal patterns designed to absorb seismic stress, a technique that requires both engineering knowledge and generations of experience in earthquake-prone regions. Mathematical constants embedded in ancient structures suggest inherited knowledge. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode relationships between its height and base that approximate pi, the ratio between a circle's circumference and diameter. Whether this was intentional or coincidental remains debated, but its appearance in multiple Old Kingdom structures hints at deliberate design. Similarly, the golden ratio, Fa, appears in the proportions of Greek temples, Gothic cathedrals, and ancient monuments across cultures. Some argue this reflects an innate human aesthetic preference for certain proportions. Others suggest it indicates transmission of mathematical knowledge from a common source, principles discovered once and then disseminated through cultural contact and inheritance. Agricultural origins present another puzzle. Conventional models describe agriculture as invented independently in multiple regions around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Valley, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, and New Guinea. The coincidence of timing, all within a few thousand years despite vastly different environments and crops, suggests either parallel evolution driven by similar environmental pressures or diffusion from a common source. The environmental pressure explanation is plausible. The end of the Ice Age created conditions favorable for plant domestication worldwide, stable climate, increased CO2 promoting plant growth, and population pressures as rising seas reduced available land. Hunter-gatherer populations worldwide might have independently begun cultivating plants in response to these shared conditions. Yet the alternative, that agricultural knowledge spread from displaced populations carrying domesticated crops and farming techniques, cannot be ruled out. If coastal populations in favorable environments had already experimented with plant cultivation during the Ice Age, developing proto-agricultural practices over millennia, they would have brought this knowledge inland when flooding forced migration. The sudden appearance of agriculture across multiple regions might then reflect not independent invention, but the dispersal of existing knowledge by refugees. Navigation knowledge presents a final mystery. How did humans reach Australia 50,000 years ago, requiring watercraft capable of crossing 90 kilometers of open ocean? How did Polynesian navigators colonize islands across the Pacific, navigating thousands of kilometers without maps or compasses? How did plants and animals domesticated in one region appear in geographically isolated regions, suggesting transoceanic contact long before documented voyages? The conventional answer is that ancient peoples were more capable seafarers than often credited, developing sophisticated boats, navigation techniques, and ocean-going cultures. This is certainly true, but it raises questions about what other maritime knowledge existed and was later lost. If coastal civilizations thrived during the Ice Age, they would have developed seafaring out of necessity, using boats for fishing, trade, and communication between settlements. When those civilizations were destroyed and survivors scattered, some would have retained maritime knowledge, becoming the ancestors of the great seafaring cultures that appear later in the archaeological record. The Phoenicians, Vikings, Polynesians, and other maritime peoples might have inherited their navigation skills from earlier traditions, techniques refined over millennia and passed through generations of sailors who never wrote their knowledge down, but transmitted it through apprenticeship and practice. The ghost civilizations, if they existed, left no documents or monuments we can definitively attribute to them, but they left something more durable: their genes in our DNA, their words in our languages, their techniques in our monuments, and their knowledge in the practices we assume were invented by historical cultures but might have been inherited from prehistory. We search for ruins underwater and under deserts, hoping to find physical evidence, but perhaps the evidence was never meant to be found in stone. Perhaps it was encoded in us, in the chromosomes we carry, the languages we speak, and the skills we practice, descendants of survivors who became our ancestors and carried forward what could not be written or built but could be remembered, adapted, and transmitted. The footprints they left are not in sand, washed away by tides, but in the very structure of human populations, migration patterns, linguistic relationships, and technological capabilities that appear too sophisticated for their supposed time. These are not proof, but patterns, anomalies that suggest inheritance from sources we have not acknowledged. If myths preserve memory of vanished civilizations, then perhaps our genes, languages, and architecture preserve their knowledge, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the questions that might reveal their origin. The ghost civilizations dissolved into us, and we carry them forward, unknowing libraries of a world that drowned. Which pieces of ancient knowledge do you think might have been inherited from lost civilizations? Is it possible that what we call civilization's beginning was actually its rebuilding? Share your thoughts below, because if knowledge survived through human transmission, carried in genes, language, and practice, then perhaps physical evidence survived too, waiting not beneath oceans or deserts, but in places we have not thought to look, inside mountains, in caves, in regions protected from catastrophe. The search for ghost civilizations is not over. It is accelerating as new technologies allow us to see what previous generations could not, revealing what has been hidden all along. The tools we develop to explore space are now turned downward, and what they show suggests the maps we have drawn of the ancient world are sketches, incomplete, and waiting for the next discovery to rewrite them entirely. For most of human history, archaeology was a game of chance. Stumble upon a ruin, notice a strange mound, follow a legend to its source, excavate where erosion exposes artifacts, or where farmers plough up pottery. The discipline relied on luck as much as expertise, finding what circumstances revealed rather than systematically searching for what might be hidden. But in the last 2 decades, the game has changed fundamentally. LiDAR, laser imaging that penetrates jungle canopy, has revealed entire cities in Central America that were invisible from the ground, their pyramids and plazas hidden beneath vegetation for centuries. Satellite multispectral analysis detects buried structures by measuring subtle differences in vegetation health and soil composition, differences invisible to the human eye, but stark in infrared and near-infrared wavelengths. Ground penetrating. Radar maps what lies beneath without digging, sending electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measuring their reflections to create 3-dimensional images of subsurface features. Underwater ROVs explore depths humans cannot reach, scanning seafloors with sonar and cameras at pressures that would crush conventional diving equipment. And artificial intelligence, trained on satellite imagery from known sites, is learning to recognize the patterns of human settlement, even when buried for millennia, identifying anomalies that human analysts might miss. We are finally developing eyes capable of seeing the invisible. And what we are finding suggests our maps of the ancient world are incomplete sketches at best, rough outlines with vast blank spaces representing not absence of sights, but absence of discovery. The transformation began with LiDAR, light detection, and ranging, a remote sensing method that uses laser pulses to measure distance. When mounted on aircraft and flown over terrain, LiDAR systems emit millions of laser pulses per second, measuring the time each pulse takes to bounce back from the ground. The resulting data creates detailed three-dimensional maps of surface topography with vertical precision measured in centimeters. The revolutionary aspect is LiDAR's ability to penetrate vegetation. While optical cameras see only the canopy, LiDAR pulses pass through gaps between leaves, some reflecting from branches and foliage, but others reaching the ground. By filtering the returns, researchers can digitally remove vegetation, revealing the bare earth surface beneath forests that have never been systematically surveyed. In the Maya region of Central America, where archaeological sites have been documented for over a century, LiDAR surveys conducted since 2015 have doubled or tripled the number of known structures. Sites that appeared on maps as isolated temple complexes were revealed as sprawling urban centers, their outlying neighborhoods and agricultural terraces invisible beneath jungle growth until LiDAR exposed them. The most dramatic example is Aguada Phoenix, discovered in 2020 in Tabasco, Mexico. LiDAR revealed a massive rectangular platform measuring 1,400 meters long, 400 meters wide, and 10 to 15 meters high, making it the largest and oldest Maya structure ever found. The platform dates to approximately 1000 BCE, predating any previously known major Maya construction by centuries. It was hidden in plain sight, so large that its edges were mistaken for natural hills, its surface covered by forest and farmland, invisible until LiDAR showed its geometric perfection. Aguada Phoenix was not unique. The same survey identified dozens of similar platforms and ceremonial complexes across a region thought to be only sparsely occupied during that period. The discovery rewrote Maya chronology, demonstrating that large-scale communal architecture and social organization existed far earlier than conventional models predicted. In Guatemala, LiDAR surveys of the Mirador Basin revealed that El Mirador, long known as one of the Maya's great early cities, was even more extensive than previously understood. The surveys mapped over 2,000 square kilometers, identifying more than 60,000 structures, including pyramids, palaces, causeways, reservoirs, and agricultural terraces. The density of settlement rivals modern urban areas, suggesting populations in the hundreds of thousands during the city's peak around 300 BCE. What makes these discoveries so significant is not merely the structures themselves, but what they imply about visibility. These sites were not remote or inaccessible. Archaeologists had been working in the region for decades, surveying, mapping, and excavating. Yet entire cities remained undetected because they were hidden beneath vegetation too dense to penetrate on foot, their scale so vast that ground-based surveys could not perceive the overall patterns. If this much was hidden in one of the most intensively studied archaeological regions on Earth, what remains hidden elsewhere? In Southeast Asia, LiDAR surveys around Angkor Wat in Cambodia revealed that the temple complex, already recognized as one of the world's great archaeological wonders, was merely the ceremonial center of a sprawling urban landscape covering more than 1,000 square kilometers. The surveys detected neighborhoods, water management systems, roads, and agricultural infrastructure extending far beyond the visible monuments, suggesting the city, at its height, around 1200 CE, was among the largest pre-industrial urban centers, comparable to modern metropolitan areas. The revelation came from a 2015 survey conducted by Australian archaeologist Damien Evans and his team. Within days of processing the LiDAR data, they identified features that would have taken decades to map using conventional ground surveys. The technology compressed years of potential fieldwork into hours of data collection and weeks of analysis. Satellite archaeology operates on different principles, but with similarly transformative results. Sarah Parcak, an archaeologist and remote sensing specialist at the University of Alabama, pioneered the use of satellite multispectral imagery to detect buried structures in Egypt and across the Mediterranean. The technique exploits the fact that buried walls, foundations, and ditches affect the soil and vegetation above them in measurable ways. Buried stone retains moisture differently than surrounding soil, creating subtle variations in surface temperature, detectable in infrared wavelengths. Vegetation growing over buried structures exhibits stress patterns, visible in near-infrared bands, that differ from plants in unmodified soil. Even ancient roads long buried and forgotten compact soil in ways that persist for millennia, affecting drainage and plant growth in patterns visible from orbit. Parcak's work in Egypt, using satellite data from NASA and commercial providers, identified 17 potential pyramids, over 1,000 tombs, and approximately 3,000 settlements previously unknown to archaeology. Ground surveys confirmed many of these identifications, including several significant tomb complexes and urban sites dating to various periods of Egyptian history. The discoveries earned her the nickname Space Archaeologist, but the real significance lies in what the technology reveals about the scale of what remains hidden. If satellites can detect thousands of sites in Egypt, one of the world's most thoroughly surveyed archaeological landscapes, then regions with less intensive survey coverage must contain vastly more undiscovered sites. In 2011, Parcak used satellite imagery to identify a Viking settlement at Point Rosie in Newfoundland, Canada, potentially the second confirmed Norse site in North America after Lonceau Meadows. While later excavations produced ambiguous results, and the Viking attribution remains debated, the methodology demonstrated that satellite archaeology could detect sites in environments and time periods far beyond its original Egyptian applications. The technology has expanded to machine learning and artificial intelligence. Algorithms trained on satellite images of known archaeological sites learn to recognize patterns, subtle geometric features, soil discolorations, and vegetation anomalies that indicate buried structures. Once trained, these algorithms can scan vast areas automatically, flagging potential sites for human review. In 2019, researchers from the University of Western Australia used machine learning to identify thousands of potential archaeological sites in Afghanistan, a region where ground surveys are dangerous or impossible due to ongoing conflict. The algorithm detected features consistent with ancient settlements, irrigation systems, and fortifications, creating a catalogue of sites that can be investigated when conditions allow. Similar projects are underway in Peru, where algorithms trained on known Nazca and Inca sites are scanning the Andes for undiscovered structures, and in Kazakhstan, where vast steppes may hide the remains of nomadic empires whose archaeological signature is subtle and easily missed by conventional surveys. Ground-penetrating radar has revolutionized archaeology closer to home. At Stonehenge in England, one of the world's most studied monuments, GPR surveys conducted in 2014 revealed a massive complex of structures surrounding the visible stones. The surveys detected 17 previously unknown ritual monuments, including a massive timber building, hundreds of burial mounds, and what appears to be a monument larger than Stonehenge itself, buried beneath the surface. The discoveries transformed understanding of Stonehenge from an isolated temple to the centre of a vast sacred landscape, a ceremonial complex that drew pilgrims from across Britain for thousands of years. The structures were invisible before GPR because they're buried, their wooden posts long rotted, their earthworks subtle and eroded, yet the radar revealed them in extraordinary detail, showing post holes, ditches, and foundations without excavating a single square meter. GPR works by transmitting electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring reflections from interfaces between materials with different electrical properties. Buried walls, foundations, and disturbed soil reflect signals differently than undisturbed earth, creating images of subsurface features. The technology is non-destructive, allowing archaeologists to map entire sites before deciding where and what to excavate. In the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, GPR surveys in recent years have detected previously unknown chambers adjacent to known tombs, including potential hidden rooms in Tutankhamun's tomb. While excavation has not yet confirmed these chambers, the surveys demonstrate that even intensively excavated sites may contain undiscovered features, spaces sealed by ancient builders and invisible to conventional investigation. Underwater archaeology has advanced through robotic technology. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras, sonar arrays, and manipulator arms can explore depths that would kill human divers, operating at pressures exceeding 300 atmospheres and in total darkness. Deepwater surveys off the coasts of Greece, Turkey, and the Levant have identified dozens of shipwrecks and submerged structures at depths previously inaccessible. In 2015, an ROV survey off the coast of Zakynthos, Greece, investigated what appeared on sonar to be ancient columns and paved surfaces at 60 meters depth. Close inspection revealed the formations were natural, the result of geological processes that created column-like features and flat surfaces mimicking construction. The discovery was disappointing, but illustrated the technology's capability to investigate ambiguous targets at depths where human verification would be impossible. More successful were surveys off the Israeli coast, where ROVs have documented submerged settlements dating to the Bronze Age and earlier, extending the known range of coastal occupation beyond what diving surveys could reach. Each discovery confirms that substantial archaeological resources lie beyond conventional diving limits, waiting for technology capable of systematic exploration. Side-scan sonar continues to improve, with modern systems capable of detecting objects smaller than a meter across at depths exceeding 6,000 meters. These systems have been used to survey proposed routes for undersea cables and pipelines, incidentally detecting archaeological features that would otherwise remain unknown. Commercial and military surveys, conducted for purposes unrelated to archaeology, have created vast databases of seafloor imagery that archaeologists are only beginning to analyze. The challenge is scale and access. The world's oceans cover 360 million square kilometers. Even if surveys focus only on continental shelves and regions that were exposed during the Ice Age, the area remains immense, and survey costs are prohibitive for most archaeological projects. What has been surveyed represents less than 20% of the seafloor at resolutions sufficient to detect archaeological features, leaving the vast majority unsearched. The pattern that emerges from all these technologies is consistent. The more we look, the more we find. And crucially, we find it in places we thought were empty, wild, uninhabited. LiDAR revealed cities where researchers saw only jungle. Satellites detected settlements where surveys found only desert. GPR showed monuments where the surface appeared blank. ROVs located structures where water seemed empty. In every case, improved visibility revealed that absence of known sites reflected not absence of sites, but limits of previous technology. The implications are profound. If the Maya lowlands, surveyed for a century, still hide thousands of structures detectable only by LiDAR, then how many sites remain hidden in regions surveyed less intensively or not at all? If Stonehenge, excavated and studied for 3 centuries, still conceals monuments detectable only by GPR, then how many undiscovered features surround other well-known sites? And if the relatively shallow coastal waters of the Mediterranean conceal structures visible only to underwater surveys, then what lies in deeper water, beyond current survey capabilities, in the zones where Ice Age coastlines would have existed? Statistics are sobering. Estimates suggest less than 10% of Maya sites have been excavated. In Egypt, despite 2 centuries of intensive archaeology, most settlements remain unexcavated, their locations known, but their contents undocumented. In Peru, archaeologists estimate that 90% or more of Inca and pre-Inca sites have never been investigated beyond surface surveys. These estimates apply to civilizations we know existed, cultures with historical records, visible monuments, and established archaeological presence. For earlier periods, the undiscovered percentage must be higher. For sites in remote regions or environments hostile to survey, the percentage approaches 100%. The desert is not empty, but unread. The jungle is not impenetrable, but unmapped. The ocean floor is not barren, but unexplored. Each technological advance reveals layers of occupation, settlement, and construction that previous methods could not detect. The process is iterative, each discovery prompting new questions and revealing how much remains unknown. As technologies improve, detection capabilities expand. Satellites launched in the coming years will carry sensors with higher resolution and more sophisticated spectral bands, capable of detecting smaller and more subtle features. LiDAR systems mounted on drones can survey at lower cost and with greater flexibility than aircraft-based systems. GPR technology is becoming portable and affordable, allowing systematic survey of landscapes previously too large or too remote to investigate thoroughly. Artificial intelligence will accelerate the process. Algorithms analyzing satellite imagery can scan entire continents in hours, flagging anomalies for human review. As training datasets grow and algorithms improve, detection accuracy will increase, identifying sites that even expert analysts might overlook. The technologies reveal structures, roads, and settlements, but structures alone do not define civilizations. What made these places living communities? What did their inhabitants believe, create, dream about? To answer those questions, we need more than maps and images. We need context, the artifacts and eco-facts that tell us how people lived, what they valued, and what stories they told themselves. Some of that context survives in the only place impervious to flood and fire, not in stone or soil, but in memory, in the myths and traditions that communities carried forward when everything else was lost. The ghost civilizations left echoes not just in structures buried and drowned, but in the stories humans continue to tell. Narratives that encode fragments of lost worlds, preserved through the only medium that survives catastrophe unchanged. The human voice speaking across generations, insisting that yes, there was something before. Yes, we remember. And yes, it matters. The question is whether we are ready to listen, to treat these stories not as fantasy but as testimony, the last record of worlds that disappeared but refused to be forgotten. Every culture remembers a golden age, a time before time when the world was young and humanity lived differently, longer, wiser, closer to the divine. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked the earth and built the first temples before withdrawing to the heavens. The Greeks spoke of the age of Cronus, the golden age before Zeus and the younger gods, when humans lived like gods themselves, free from toil and suffering. Hindu cosmology describes Satya Yuga, the age of truth and righteousness, before the slow degradation through Treta, Dvapara, and finally Kali Yuga, the current age of discord and decline. Chinese tradition remembers the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine rulers of prehistory who taught humanity the fundamental arts of civilization. Mesoamerican cycles speak of previous worlds, 4 or 5 ages that preceded our own, each destroyed by catastrophe before the current world emerged. The pattern repeats across unconnected cultures. There was an earlier, greater world. It ended in catastrophe, and we are the diminished children of its survivors, living in the shadow of achievements we can no longer match. Myth, obviously. The psychological projection of dissatisfaction onto an imagined past. The universal human tendency to romanticize what came before and lament the present as fallen, unless it is memory. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, pervades religious texts from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The pyramid. Texts carved into royal burial chambers around 2400 BCE describe the king ascending to join the gods who established order during Zep Tepi, when the primeval mound emerged from the waters of Nun and Atum, the creator, stood upon it to begin the work of creation. From Atum came Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. From them came Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And from Geb and Nut came Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the gods who would govern the world and teach humanity. This theological genealogy is not merely religious but temporal. The texts describe Zep Tepi as a historical epoch, a time when divine beings ruled Egypt directly, establishing the temples, codifying the rituals, and creating the institutions that later pharaohs would inherit and maintain. When pharaohs were crowned, the ceremony was described as a renewal of Zep Tepi, a return to first principles, a restoration of the original order. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on temple walls during the Ptolemaic period, around 200 BCE, but preserving much older traditions, describe in detail how the first temples were built during Zep Tepi. The texts speak of the gods of the primeval age, who raised structures on the island of creation, a place that emerged from water and became the foundation of sacred architecture. The language is mythological, but the specificity suggests it preserves memories of actual construction, a time when temples were established by founders whose identities had been lost, but whose work remained. The time frame is deliberately vague, placed in illotempore, outside historical time, but some texts provide hints, references in temple inscriptions to astronomical alignments corresponding to star positions thousands of years before the texts were written, suggest the authors were describing or referencing events in the deep past, not recent history, mythologized, but ancient history preserved. Greek tradition divides time into ages of progressive decline. Hesiod's works and days, composed around 700 BCE, describes 5 ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. The Golden Age under Cronus was a time of ease and abundance, when the earth produced food without labour, and humans lived without suffering or aging. When they died, it was like falling asleep, and they became benevolent spirits, watching over later generations. The Silver Age was lesser, characterized by foolishness and hubris. The Bronze Age brought violence and warfare. The Heroic Age, an interpolation that disrupts the pattern of decline, was the time of the great heroes celebrated in epic poetry, figures like Achilles and Odysseus. Finally came the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, marked by toil, suffering, and moral degradation. The pattern is explicitly one of degeneration, each age worse than the one before. While this reflects Greek pessimism about human progress, it also mirrors what would occur if an advanced civilization collapsed and survivors rebuilt from fragments, each generation possessing less knowledge than the previous until the original achievements became legendary and finally mythical. Hindu cosmology extends the concept of cyclical time to vast scales. The yugas are ages of the world, each lasting thousands or hundreds of thousands of years depending on the text. Satya Yuga, the first and longest, is characterized by virtue, wisdom, and long lifespans. Humans live in harmony with cosmic law, and suffering is minimal. Treta Yuga sees the introduction of imbalance, virtue declining to 3/4, of its original strength. Dvapara Yuga continues the decline, with virtue at half strength and vice increasing. Kali Yuga, the current age, is the darkest, with virtue reduced to 1/4 and humanity characterized by conflict, materialism, and spiritual ignorance. The cycle ends with the destruction of the world, followed by renewal and the beginning of a new Satya Yuga. The process repeats eternally, creation and destruction, alternating in rhythms determined by cosmic law rather than divine caprice. The Mahabharata, one of India's great epics, is set at the transition between Dvapara and Kali Yuga, approximately 5,000 years ago according to traditional chronology. The epic describes the end of an age when divine beings still walked among humans and knowledge of sacred sciences was more widespread than in later times. The text itself laments the decline that will follow, predicting the characteristics of Kali Yuga with remarkable accuracy. Short lifespans, widespread conflict, loss of sacred knowledge, and moral corruption. If the Yugas preserve memory rather than philosophical abstraction, they describe exactly what would follow a catastrophic collapse. An initial period of recovery when survivors still possessed knowledge and resources, followed by gradual decline as resources depleted, knowledge was lost through failure to transmit it fully, and populations fragmented. The long timescales in the texts may be symbolic or exaggerated, but the pattern of decline fits post-catastrophe scenarios. Mesoamerican cosmology describes multiple previous worlds, each inhabited by different versions of humanity and each destroyed by specific catastrophes. The Aztec tradition, recorded in colonial-era texts like the Leyenda de los Soles, describes 5 suns or world ages. The first age ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second ended in hurricanes. The third in rain of fire. The fourth, most relevant to our investigation, ended in a great flood that transformed humans into fish. The Maya Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya, describes the gods creating and destroying multiple versions of humanity, dissatisfied with their creations. One group is destroyed by a flood of resin and pitch that turns the world black. The survivors hide in caves or climb trees, but are ultimately annihilated. Only after multiple attempts do the gods create the current humanity from maize, the ancestors of the Maya people. These narratives are clearly mythological in their details, but they preserve a core memory. The world has been destroyed before, previous peoples have perished, and the current age is not the first but the latest in a series of creations. If floods and catastrophes did destroy earlier settlements, these myths encode that memory, transformed through retelling but retaining the essential truth. Chinese tradition places the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors at the beginning of civilization, semi-divine or superhuman rulers who taught humanity essential skills. Fuxi invented fishing, hunting and writing. Shennong taught agriculture and herbal medicine. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, established government, warfare, and cultural institutions. These figures are placed in a time before verifiable history, thousands of years before the first documented dynasties. The texts describing them, compiled during the Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE but drawing on earlier sources, treat them as historical figures whose actual existence was accepted as fact. Later Confucian scholars debated their chronology and achievements, but not their reality. Only modern scholarship has reclassified them as mythological, cultural heroes, invented to provide moral examples rather than historical rulers. Yet the specificity of their innovations suggests they may preserve memory of actual knowledge bearers, individuals, or groups who introduced technologies and practices that transformed society. If these teachers were refugees from more advanced coastal civilizations, their contributions would have seemed almost magical to inland populations, leading to their eventual deification and incorporation into mythology. The academic interpretation of Golden Age myths has traditionally emphasized psychological and sociological functions. Mircea Eliade, in The Myth of the Eternal Return, argued that traditional societies orient themselves toward an ideal past, a sacred time when gods and heroes establish the patterns that humans must follow. The Golden Age serves as an archetype, a model of perfection against which the present is measured and found wanting. Carl Jung proposed that Golden Age myths emerge from the collective, unconscious, universal symbols representing psychological states of wholeness and integration that individuals and cultures strive to achieve or recover. The Golden Age is not a historical period, but a psychological ideal, the self before trauma or fragmentation. These interpretations explain the universality of Golden Age myths without requiring actual lost civilizations. Humans everywhere experience nostalgia, romanticize the past, and project their dissatisfaction onto narratives of decline. The myths serve social functions, providing moral instruction, justifying current institutions as restoration of ancient ideals, and offering hope that decline can be reversed through return to first principles. Yet these interpretations struggle to account for the specificity and consistency of the myths. If they are purely psychological, why do they cluster around similar timeframes when calendrical correlations can be established? Why do they describe environmental catastrophes, floods, and fires that correspond to actual geological events? Why do they include details about lost lands, drowned cities, and displaced populations that align with what we now know about sea level rise and climate change? The archaeological correlation is striking. The abrupt appearance of agriculture, monumental architecture, and complex social organization around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE occurs precisely when Golden Age myths place the end of earlier worlds and the beginning of the current age. This could be coincidence, the myths invented to explain the transition visible in the archaeological record. Or it could be memory, the myths preserving oral traditions of the actual catastrophes that displaced coastal populations and forced them to rebuild in highland environments. Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9500 BCE, appears without precedent at precisely the moment Golden Age myths describe the transition from a previous world to the current one. The site's sophistication suggests its builders possessed knowledge developed elsewhere, knowledge they brought with them rather than invented on site. If those builders were refugees from flooded lowlands, the myths describing wise teachers arriving after catastrophe would be historical memory mythologized through generations of retelling. The timescales embedded in some myths are surprisingly specific. The Egyptian chronology, compiled by the Hellenistic priest Manetho, places the reign of the gods and demigods in Egypt at tens of thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses these figures as mythological inflation, but they place the divine age in the same time frame as the Younger Dryas and the subsequent flooding, the period when actual catastrophes occurred and populations were displaced. Plato's account of Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias, while obviously containing fictional embellishments, specifically dates the civilization's destruction to 9600 BCE, approximately 11,600 years ago. This date places Atlantis at the end of the Younger Dryas, precisely when rapid environmental changes would have destroyed coastal civilizations if they existed. Plato claims to have received the story through Egyptian priestly sources, suggesting it may preserve elements of actual Egyptian tradition about antediluvian civilizations. Whether Atlantis itself existed is less important than what the story represents: the memory of catastrophic destruction of an advanced society, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down with details added or corrupted through transmission. If the core of the story, that a civilization was destroyed by floods around 9600 BCE, is accurate, then Plato's account is not fantasy, but history, embellished and mythologized, but rooted in real events. The Golden Age myths could be wish fulfillment, psychological projection, or religious allegory. They could represent humanity's universal tendency to believe things were once better and to seek return to an idealized past. This interpretation is safe, requiring no revision of established chronologies or acceptance of controversial claims. Or the myths could be memory, the deepest memory our species possesses, memory of a time when the world was different, when coastlines extended farther, when rivers flowed through lands now desert, when civilizations thrived in places now drowned or buried. Memory transmitted orally for so long that facts became fable, specifics became symbols, and real places became allegory. But memory nonetheless, the true story passed through so many generations that its form changed utterly while its core remained intact. If ghost civilizations existed during the Ice Age, flourishing on coasts now submerged and plains now sand, then the Golden Age is not fantasy. It is memory, the memory of a world our distant ancestors inhabited before the catastrophe, before the flood, before history began, and forgot them. Perhaps we do not yearn for a golden age that never existed. Perhaps we remember one that did, encoded so deeply in cultural traditions that we preserved it through language, myth, and ritual, even when physical evidence vanished. The memories are there, woven into every culture's origin stories, every tradition's cosmology, every civilization's narrative of how the world began. The question is whether we recognize them as memories or dismiss them as myths, whether we are willing to consider that the stories we tell about the past might contain more truth than the timelines we have constructed from incomplete evidence. And so we return to the beginning, to the question that started this investigation. If civilizations existed before the ones we have documented, where did they go? The answer is everywhere and nowhere. They dissolved into the survivors who became our ancestors. Their cities submerged beneath oceans, buried under deserts, or destroyed so completely that only shadows remain. They left traces in our genes, our languages, our myths and our techniques, evidence that requires new eyes to see and new frameworks to interpret. The search continues, not in a single dramatic discovery, but in the accumulation of anomalies, the slow recognition that the patterns we have dismissed might be patterns after all, and that the silence we interpreted as absence might be the silence of archives we have not yet learned to read. The ghost civilizations remain ghosts, visible only in fragments, comprehensible only through inference, real only if we are willing to question what we thought we knew about where we came from and how long we have been building, destroying, and rebuilding the world. Every culture remembers a golden age, a time before time when the world was young and humanity lived differently, longer, wiser, closer to the divine. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked the earth and built the first temples before withdrawing to the heavens. The Greeks spoke of the age of Cronus, the golden age before Zeus and the younger gods, when humans lived like gods themselves, free from toil and suffering. Hindu cosmology describes Satya Yuga, the age of truth and righteousness, before the slow degradation through Treta, Dvapara, and finally Kali Yuga, the current age of discord and decline. Chinese tradition remembers the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine rulers of prehistory who taught humanity the fundamental arts of civilization. Mesoamerican cycles speak of previous worlds, 4 or 5 ages that preceded our own, each destroyed by catastrophe before the current world emerged. The pattern repeats across unconnected cultures. There was an earlier, greater world, it ended in catastrophe, and we are the diminished children of its survivors, living in the shadow of achievements we can no longer match. Myth, obviously, the psychological projection of dissatisfaction onto an imagined past, the universal human tendency to romanticize what came before and lament the present as fallen. unless it is memory. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, pervades religious texts from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The pyramid texts, carved into royal burial chambers around 2400 BCE, describe the king ascending to join the gods who established order during Zep Tepi, when the primeval mound emerged from the waters of Nun and Atum. The creator stood upon it to begin the work of creation. From Atum came Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. From them came Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And from Geb and Nut came Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, the gods who would govern the world and teach humanity. This theological genealogy is not merely religious but temporal. The texts describe Zep Tepi as a historical epoch, a time when divine beings ruled Egypt directly, establishing the temples, codifying the rituals, and creating the institutions that later pharaohs would inherit and maintain. When pharaohs were crowned, the ceremony was described as a renewal of Zep Tepi, a return to first principles, a restoration of the original order. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on temple walls during the Ptolemaic period around 200 BCE, but preserving much older traditions, describe in detail how the first temples were built during Zep Tepi. The texts speak of the gods of the primeval age, who raised structures on the island of creation, a place that emerged from water and became the foundation of sacred architecture. The language is mythological, but the specificity suggests it preserves memories of actual construction, a time when temples were established by founders whose identities had been lost, but whose work remained. The time frame is deliberately vague, placed in illo tempore, outside historical time, but some texts provide hints, references in temple inscriptions to astronomical alignments corresponding to star positions thousands of years before the texts were written, suggest the authors were describing or referencing events in the deep past, not recent history, mythologized, but ancient history, preserved. Greek tradition divides time into ages of progressive decline. Hesiod's Works and Days, composed around 700 BCE, describes 5 ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. The Golden Age under Cronus was a time of ease and abundance, when the earth produced food without labour, and humans lived without suffering or aging. When they died, it was like falling asleep, and they became benevolent spirits watching over later generations. The Silver Age was lesser, characterized by foolishness and hubris. The Bronze Age brought violence and warfare. The Heroic Age, an interpolation that disrupts the pattern of decline, was the time of the great heroes celebrated in epic poetry, figures like Achilles and Odysseus. Finally came the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, marked by toil, suffering, and moral degradation. The pattern is explicitly one of degeneration, each age worse than the one before. While this reflects Greek pessimism about human progress, it also mirrors what would occur if an advanced civilization collapsed and survivors rebuilt from fragments, each generation possessing less knowledge than the previous, until the original achievements became legendary and finally mythical. Hindu cosmology extends the concept of cyclical time to vast scales. The yugas are ages of the world, each lasting thousands or hundreds of thousands of years depending on the text. Satya Yuga, the first and longest, is characterized by virtue, wisdom, and long lifespans. Humans live in harmony with cosmic law, and suffering is minimal. Treta Yuga sees the introduction of imbalance, virtue declining to 3/4 of its original strength. Dvapara Yuga continues the decline, with virtue at half strength and vice increasing. Kali Yuga, the current age, is the darkest, with virtue reduced to 1/4 and humanity characterized by conflict, materialism, and spiritual ignorance. The cycle ends with the destruction of the world, followed by renewal and the beginning of a new Satya Yuga. The process repeats eternally, creation and destruction alternating in rhythms determined by cosmic law rather than divine caprice. The Mahabharata, one of India's great epics, is set at the transition between Dvapara and Kali Yuga, approximately 5,000 years ago, according to traditional chronology. The epic describes the end of an age when divine beings still walked among humans, and knowledge of sacred sciences was more widespread than in later times. The text itself laments the decline that will follow, predicting the characteristics of Kali Yuga with remarkable accuracy: short lifespans, widespread conflict, loss of sacred knowledge, and moral corruption. If the yugas preserve memory rather than philosophical abstraction, they describe exactly what would follow a catastrophic collapse: an initial period of recovery when survivors still possessed knowledge and resources, followed by gradual decline as resources depleted, knowledge was lost through failure to transmit it fully, and populations fragmented. The long time scales in the texts may be symbolic or exaggerated, but the pattern of decline fits post-catastrophe scenarios. Mesoamerican cosmology describes multiple previous worlds, each inhabited by different versions of humanity and each destroyed by specific catastrophes. The Aztec tradition, recorded in colonial-era texts like the Leyenda de los Soles, describes 5 suns or world ages. The first age ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second ended in hurricanes. The third in rain of fire. The fourth, most relevant to our investigation, ended in a great flood that transformed humans into fish. The Maya Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya, describes the gods creating and destroying multiple versions of humanity, dissatisfied with their creations. One group is destroyed by a flood of resin and pitch that turns the world black. The survivors hide in caves or climb trees, but are ultimately annihilated. Only after multiple attempts do the gods create the current humanity from maize, the ancestors of the Maya people. These narratives are clearly mythological in their details, but they preserve a core memory. The world has been destroyed before, previous peoples have perished, and the current age is not the first but the latest in a series of creations. If floods and catastrophes did destroy earlier settlements, these myths encode that memory, transformed through retelling but retaining the essential truth. Chinese tradition places the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors at the beginning of civilization, semi-divine or superhuman rulers who taught humanity essential skills. Fuxi invented fishing, hunting and writing. Shennong taught agriculture and herbal medicine. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, established government, warfare and cultural institutions. These figures are placed in a time before verifiable history, thousands of years before the first documented dynasties. The texts describing them, compiled during the Han Dynasty around 100 BCA, but drawing on earlier sources, treat them as historical figures whose actual existence was accepted as fact. Later Confucian scholars debated their chronology and achievements, but not their reality. Only modern scholarship has reclassified them as mythological, cultural heroes, invented to provide moral examples rather than historical rulers. Yet the specificity of their innovations suggests they may preserve memory of actual knowledge bearers, individuals, or groups who introduced technologies and practices that transformed society. If these teachers were refugees from more advanced coastal civilizations, their contributions would have seemed almost magical to inland populations, leading to their eventual deification and incorporation into mythology. The academic interpretation of Golden Age myths has traditionally emphasized psychological and sociological functions. Mircea Eliade, in The Myth of the Eternal Return, argued that traditional societies orient themselves toward an ideal past, a sacred time when gods and heroes establish the patterns that humans must follow. The Golden Age serves as an archetype, a model of perfection against which the present is measured and found wanting. Carl Jung proposed that Golden Age myths emerge from the collective, unconscious, universal symbols, representing psychological states of wholeness and integration that individuals and cultures strive to achieve or recover. The Golden Age is not a historical period, but a psychological ideal, the self before trauma or fragmentation. These interpretations explain the universality of Golden Age myths without requiring actual lost civilizations. Humans everywhere experience nostalgia, romanticize the past, and project their dissatisfaction onto narratives of decline. The myths serve social functions, providing moral instruction, justifying current institutions as restoration of ancient ideals, and offering hope that decline can be reversed through return to first principles. Yet these interpretations struggle to account for the specificity and consistency of the myths. If they are purely psychological, why do they cluster around similar timeframes when calendrical correlations can be established? Why do they describe environmental catastrophes, floods and fires that correspond to actual geological events? Why do they include details about lost lands, drowned cities and displaced populations that align with what we now know about sea level rise and climate change? The archaeological correlation is striking. The abrupt appearance of agriculture, monumental architecture, and complex social organization around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE occurs precisely when Golden Age myths place the end of earlier worlds and the beginning of the current age. This could be coincidence, the myths invented to explain the transition visible in the archaeological record, or it could be memory, the myths preserving oral traditions of the actual catastrophes that displaced coastal populations and forced them to rebuild in highland environments. Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9500 BCE, appears without precedent at precisely the moment Golden Age myths describe the transition from a previous world to the current one. The site's sophistication suggests its builders possessed knowledge developed elsewhere, knowledge they brought with them rather than invented on site. If those builders were refugees from flooded lowlands, the myths describing wise teachers arriving after catastrophe would be historical memory mythologized through generations of retelling. The timescales embedded in some myths are surprisingly specific. The Egyptian chronology, compiled by the Hellenistic priest Manetho, places the reign of the gods and demigods in Egypt at tens of thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses these figures as mythological inflation, but they place the divine age in the same time frame as the Younger Dryas and the subsequent flooding, the period when actual catastrophes occurred and populations were displaced. Plato's account of Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias, while obviously containing fictional embellishments, specifically dates the civilization's destruction to 9600 BCE, approximately 11,600 years ago. This date places Atlantis at the end of the Younger Dryas, precisely when rapid environmental changes would have destroyed coastal civilizations if they existed. Plato claims to have received the story through Egyptian priestly sources, suggesting it may preserve elements of actual Egyptian tradition about antediluvian civilizations. Whether Atlantis itself existed is less important than what the story represents. The memory of catastrophic destruction of an advanced society, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down with details added or corrupted through transmission. If the core of the story, that a civilization was destroyed by floods around 9600 BCE, is accurate, then Plato's account is not fantasy but history, embellished and mythologized but rooted in real events. The Golden Age myths could be wish fulfillment, psychological projection, or religious allegory. They could represent humanity's universal tendency to believe things were once better and to seek return to an idealized past. This interpretation is safe, requiring no revision of established chronologies or acceptance of controversial claims. Or the myths could be memory, the deepest memory our species possesses, memory of a time when the world was different, when coastlines extended farther, when rivers flowed through lands now desert, when civilizations thrived in places now drowned or buried. Memory transmitted orally for so long that facts became fable, specifics became symbols, and real places became allegory. But memory nonetheless, the true story passed through so many generations that its form changed utterly, while its core remained intact. If ghost civilizations existed during the Ice Age, flourishing on coasts now submerged and plains now sand, then the Golden Age is not fantasy, it is memory. The memory of a world our distant ancestors inhabited before the catastrophe, before the flood, before history began and forgot them. Perhaps we do not yearn for a golden age that never existed. Perhaps we remember one that did, encoded so deeply in cultural traditions that we preserved it through language, myth, and ritual, even when physical evidence vanished. The memories are there, woven into every culture's origin stories, every tradition's cosmology, every civilization's narrative of how the world began. The question is whether we recognize them as memories or dismiss them as myths, whether we are willing to consider that the stories we tell about the past might contain more truth than the timelines we have constructed from incomplete evidence. And so we return to the beginning, to the question that started this investigation. If civilizations existed before the ones we have documented, where did they go? The answer is everywhere and nowhere. They dissolved into the survivors who became our ancestors. Their cities submerged beneath oceans, buried under deserts, or destroyed so completely that only shadows remain. They left traces in our genes, our languages, our myths and our techniques, evidence that requires new eyes to see and new frameworks to interpret. The search continues, not in a single dramatic discovery, but in the accumulation of anomalies. The slow recognition that the patterns we have dismissed might be patterns after all, and that the silence we interpreted as absence might be the silence of archives we have not yet learned to read. The ghost civilizations remain ghosts, visible only in fragments, comprehensible only through inference, real only if we are willing to question what we thought we knew about where we came from and how long we have been building, destroying, and rebuilding the world. Imagine standing on a beach at night. The tide is out, sand stretches endlessly under starlight, wet and reflective where the water has retreated. The moon hangs low on the horizon, casting silver across the ocean's surface. You are alone, or nearly so, with only the sound of waves and the occasional cry of seabirds circling in darkness. Beneath your feet, invisible but real, lie the buried remnants of worlds that came before. Shells compressed into stone over millennia, forests that grew when sea levels were lower, their stumps preserved in anaerobic mud. Perhaps even the foundations of settlements, fishing villages or coastal towns built when the shoreline extended farther out, now covered by water and sediment, forgotten by everyone except the ocean that took them. The earth is layered with forgetting. Every stratum of rock and soil was once a present moment, as vivid as this one, as full of human life, ambition, and dreams. The ghost civilizations are beneath those layers. Not ghosts because they were imaginary, but ghosts because they are forgotten, buried so deep that only traces remain. A flood myth here, a submerged wall there, a mathematical constant that appears too early, a memory preserved in stone and story, but not in the textbooks that claim to tell us where we came from. They were real. They thrived. They vanished. And in vanishing, they left the greatest mystery archaeology has yet to solve. The evidence presented across this investigation forms a pattern, not proof, but accumulation. Sea levels rose 120 meters since the Ice Age, submerging millions of square kilometers of coastline where human populations would have naturally clustered. Sites like Atlit Yam demonstrate that sophisticated settlements can be drowned and forgotten, preserved underwater until modern technology reveals them. The Persian Gulf was a fertile river valley until 8,000 years ago, precisely the region where ancient myths place antediluvian cities. Structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and throughout the Mediterranean suggest construction in places now submerged, though their age and origin remain contested. Deserts hide cities beneath sand. Karakoto, the Silk Road settlements, and Garamantes complexes prove that urban centres can be buried and lost, recovered only through deliberate search. The Younger Dryas catastrophe, 12,900 years ago, provides a mechanism for sudden comprehensive destruction. Fire and flood on a scale that would erase civilizations so thoroughly that only their hardest works might survive, scattered and misinterpreted. Myths from every culture remember floods, describe golden ages before catastrophe, and speak of wise teachers who appeared after destruction to rebuild civilization. Australian Aboriginal stories preserve memories of coastal lands submerged 10,000 years ago, confirmed by geology. If oral tradition can maintain accuracy across hundreds of generations, then other flood myths might similarly encode real events rather than fantasy. Genetic bottlenecks, linguistic anomalies, and architectural knowledge appearing without precedent suggest inheritance from earlier populations. Refugees from drowned coasts carrying knowledge inland to groups that had been isolated. And new technologies, LiDAR, satellites, ground-penetrating radar, underwater ROVs, continue revealing what was always there but invisible. Cities hidden beneath jungle, settlements buried under sand, structures submerged beneath waves. Each discovery confirms the pattern. Absence of evidence reflected limits of technology, not absence of sights. As tools improve, the invisible becomes visible, and maps of the ancient world expand to include what was dismissed as empty wilderness. The pattern of loss and recovery is older than we assumed. Civilizations are fragile, more vulnerable to environmental change than we like to believe. Sea level rise, desertification, and catastrophic impacts can erase millennia of development in decades or centuries, scattering populations and severing cultural continuity. What we call the beginning of civilization may be its resumption, survivors rebuilding from fragments rather than inventing from zero. Knowledge is harder to preserve than we think. Without writing, without durable materials, without stable environments, information degrades rapidly across generations. What takes centuries to develop can be lost in a single, catastrophic event, recoverable only if survivors remember enough to transmit it forward. The archaeological record shows not linear progress, but cycles, expansions followed by collapses, each one erasing portions of what came before. Time erases ruthlessly. 12,012 years is nothing to geology, but an eternity to archaeology. Organic materials decay, metal corrodes, stone weathers. Only in the most protected environments, underwater sealed by sediment or desert preserved by aridity, do artifacts survive. Everywhere else, evidence dissolves, leaving gaps that we interpret as absence rather than recognizing them as erasure. This investigation set out to find ghost civilizations, lost cities that disappeared without a trace. What it found instead is that the traces are everywhere, just not in the forms we expected. Not intact cities waiting to be excavated, but scattered evidence requiring synthesis across disciplines, geology and mythology, genetics and linguistics, underwater archaeology and remote sensing, oral tradition and technological analysis. The ghost civilizations are ghosts not because they never existed, but because catastrophe destroyed them so completely that conventional archaeology struggles to acknowledge their reality. They challenge the comfortable narrative of civilization emerging from primitive origins in a steady upward trajectory. They suggest instead that history is cyclical, that we have built before and lost it, that the story of human achievement is not linear ascent, but rhythm, expansion and contraction, creation and destruction, memory and forgetting. What this means for us is humbling. Our own civilization, with all its complexity and technological sophistication, is as vulnerable as those that came before. Sea levels continue rising, climate patterns shift, catastrophic events remain possible. The cities we build on coastlines could be the submerged ruins future archaeologists puzzle over, debating whether we possessed the knowledge we claimed or whether our monuments were lucky accidents. Impermanence is the only permanence. Everything we build will eventually erode, flood, or be buried. The question is not whether our works will survive, but what traces they will leave, and whether future generations will recognize them for what they were. Yet there is something almost beautiful in mystery, in not knowing, in recognizing the limits of what can be recovered. The ghost civilizations remain ghosts, and perhaps that is appropriate. Some questions resist answers, some silences should be respected. The unknown is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted. The acknowledgement that we are small, recent, and surrounded by depths we have barely begun to explore. The search continues not because definitive proof awaits discovery, but because searching is what we do. Humans are curious, restless, unsatisfied with incomplete knowledge. Every year brings new surveys, new technologies, new discoveries that add fragments to the puzzle. The Persian Gulf floor will eventually be mapped systematically. Deeper ocean regions will be explored. Deserts will yield more buried cities. LiDAR will reveal more hidden structures. Each discovery will answer some questions and raise others. The ghost civilizations may become less ghostly, their existence confirmed, their locations documented, their achievements understood. Or they may remain as they are, suggested but unproven, visible in patterns but not in artifacts, real only to those willing to see evidence in absence and hear testimony in silence. The cities are waiting in the dark, some beneath crushing ocean depths where only robots can reach, some under meters of desert sand where excavation requires decades of effort, some in jungles so dense that even LiDAR struggles to penetrate fully, and some perhaps are simply gone, erased so completely that no trace survives, remembered only in myths we half believe, and questions we cannot stop asking. But the search continues because beneath the myths and missing evidence, beneath the flooded shelves and buried valleys, lies a truth about human history we are only beginning to glimpse. We are older than we remember, more resilient than we imagine, and connected across time to peoples whose names we will never know, but whose legacy lives in every story of a golden age lost, in every flood myth preserved, in every architectural mystery that whispers of forgotten knowledge. The ghost civilizations are ghosts, but ghosts sometimes leave footprints, and we are learning to see them in the genetic patterns that mark ancient migrations, in the linguistic connections that span oceans, in the astronomical alignments that encode timescales we did not expect, in the monuments that stand when everything else has fallen. If one of these lost civilizations could be definitively proven tomorrow, Atlantis beneath the Atlantic, cities under the Persian Gulf, Ice Age metropolises off the coast of India, which would reshape history most profoundly? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to continue exploring the mysteries buried beneath our feet and hidden beneath the waves, subscribe and join us. The ghosts are waiting, and their story is not over. It is just beginning, as each new tool, each new survey, and each new question brings us closer to understanding not where civilization began, but how many times it has begun, how many times it has fallen, and how many times survivors have carried forward just enough to start again. The beach is dark, the tide will return, and somewhere beneath the waves, beneath the sand, beneath the forgetting, lie the cities that time could not quite erase, waiting for the moment when we finally ask the right questions and look in the right places, ready to remember what we thought we had lost forever.